Hello and welcome to a Conquest, the last argument of Kings list review and analysis video. Lists have been submitted for Clash at the Coast 2025, which promises to be one of the larger events that Australia has had. It's rivaling CanCon in size with 22 players, and is happening next weekend in Nowra, Australia. In this video, as we will usually do in these videos, we'll be going through all 22 lists, talking about them, what I think is interesting about them, how do I think they play, how do I think you might play against them, and generally just taking a look at the field of players that we will see taking place at Clash at the Coast. Now, as always, the caveat here comes that these are just sort of my perspectives, my takes. I'm looking at all of these lists, bar my own, obviously, for the first time as part of this video. I didn't get given them in advance. They've all been submitted and locked, and so this is just my take looking at a list probably for the first time, and talking about what I think is interesting about it and how it might play. If you are a player of one of these lists and you think I have gotten something wrong, please do let me know, post in the comments, anything like that, because a lot goes into making, refining, and perfecting a Conquest list for competitive play, and the nuances can very easily be lost in just some dude taking a first look as part of a video like this. With that caveat out of the way, let's jump into some stats for the event and then get into the lists. So, as noted, we've got 22 players at Clash of the Coast this year, which means it is basically as big as CanCon. We also have every faction represented. We've got 200 Kingdoms players, 2 City-States players, 4 Dweghom, 3 Nords, 4 Old Dominion, 1 each for Sorcerer Kings and Spires, 2 for Wadhrun, and 3 for Yoroni. Now, seeing the Yoroni is particularly cool because they have really just very recently come tournament legal. Models have made their way into the wild. We've gotten them in Australia, and it looks like, there have been 3 players who have managed to buy and get together Yoroni lists. Old Dominion and Dweghom in large numbers is also not particularly surprising, just because I know from personal experience that those are popular across kind of Southeast Australia. And while we do actually have players, I think, attending from basically everywhere in Australia to this event, there's at least one player from Western Australia, which is a hell of a flight. There are players coming down from Queensland. The presence of Old Dominion and Dweghom, because this is broadly an Eastern Seaboard / Southeast Australia kind of event, that's not particularly surprising. Otherwise, a pretty normal distribution, with really only notably low numbers of Spires and Sorcerer Kings players, although each of those is represented as well. Again, not necessarily hugely surprising. Sorcerer Kings are in the waiting on an update, and Spires are in the really waiting on an update stage. I think you can actually build very competitively powerful lists, especially for Spires, but then also to an extent for Sorcerer Kings, if you wanted to play them at an event, but I think most players who own multiple armies will probably be shelving them for the next few months, maybe Spires for a little longer, while waiting for updates to each faction. Otherwise, that's a really good, solid, healthy distribution, and it looks like it'll be a really interesting event. Now, jumping into the lists, we're going to start with Yoroni for a couple of reasons. First is that they're the newest faction, and therefore pretty interesting. The second is that the things that Parabellum's Army Builder does to Yoroni when it presents them both as a copy-paste list and as a PDF is a crime against man and God, and I want to have all of my mental energy available to actually read this and talk through it. And finally, there's an interesting thing that's happened with the 3 players Yoroni lists, which is that 2 of the players have, as far as I can tell pretty independently, arrived at almost identical lists, and then the 3rd player has come up with a pretty interesting curveball. Now, this is not surprising when we think about factions that are very, very early in their release cycle. Yoroni only have a few regiments and a few characters to play with, and so there are only going to be so many ways to configure that, even with the Yoroni modular regiment rule. And so our first 2 players, Saxon and Reese, have arrived at what I basically think is probably the best Yoroni list that you can build with those models, with variations really just accounting for personal preference. By comparison, Daniel, our 3rd Yoroni player, has done something well off-piste that promises to be very interesting, but maybe a little less mechanically powerful, but we'll have to take a look. So we're going to start with Saxon's list, with the caveat that Reese's list is identical, except for a couple of very small things that we'll point out when we talk about Reese's list. So Saxon has begun with a Daimyo. The Daimyo is the most dangerous next to the Kitsune of the Yoroni characters, with Cleave 2. This Yoroni has Hachiwa, which is the mastery that allows his regiment to ignore the effects of hindering terrain, which is particularly powerful to have on a Daimyo, because a Daimyo is Ka. That's the card that a Daimyo can activate to get a bonus, and Ka gives a bonus to impact and brutal impact for the regiment. So by stacking Ka and the ability to ignore hindering, you unlock plays like, for example, March charges through hindering terrain that can still do a fair amount of impact damage thanks to the native impact and trample, etc. of the regiment the daimyo is in. So powerful combat beta that also lets his regiment ignore hindering, and he is in, and all of the regiments here will be modular regiments. He is in a modular regiment of 2 Kami and 1 Oni. So that's a regiment led by a Kami stand, which means it gets +1 to defense and evasion, which turns it into an absolute brick. With the daimyo in the regiment, you are defense 4, resolve 4, and at least for the first 5 wounds, you'll have +1 size for resolve bonuses, so defense 4, resolve 5. If you activate off of a chi card when you activate the regiment, you'll also get Indomitable 2, which, coupled with the native 6 wounds per stand of most Oni regiments, certainly of Oni and Kami, or most Yoroni regiments, Oni and Kami built in particular, you have just a real brick of a unit. 18 wounds with very high defenses, and because it's a modular regiment with a daimyo and an Oni in it, and you will have the Kami command stand generally, and then the Oni and the daimyo will be in the front rank as well. Sometimes you might go 4 wide, but often you'll go 3 wide because the second Kami's real job is just to make the regiment legal, provide more trample, etc. So he can safely go in the back and still contribute. That gives you a lot of cleave to attacks and a lot of impacts and a bunch of trample, like 4 trample hits just as supplementary, which combined lets the regiment just brawl really, really well. It's expensive, yeah, it's 240 points with a 130 point character, but it punches on, it does great damage, it's got a mix of cleave to attacks and lots of hits, which means that there's no individual regiment generally that has particularly efficient defenses. If you're saving on evasion, no worries, it'll still do lots of hits. If you've got relying on high defense, it's got enough cleave to really give you some pain. It's just generally well-rounded, and in fact we are going to see almost every character block in this army, and in Reese's army, is built on that module, which is Kami, Kami, Oni, the Oni for some punch, the Kami for the regiment rolls. We then, in the Daimyo's Warband, have 2 more modular regiments of a pair of Oni Ayakashi each, and the Oni regiments are their punches. They're not particularly durable. There are only 2 stands, they will auto-rally if you lose 1. But 12 wounds, defense 3, resolve 3 is just kind of okay for like MSU standards. That is not a particularly durable, not a particularly weak, but not a particularly durable MSU. However, it will do plenty of damage. With the Oni leading the regiment, you'll have 13 cleave 2, clash 3 attacks coming out of that regiment, and you'll have reasonable impacts when you charge if you activate off of a Ka card. And most importantly, you have the exceptional Juggernaut rule. Juggernaut gives these guys an 11-inch charge, and that lets them kind of posture a little further back or arrive a little later. Basically gives you some flexible play and a lot of punch. There is nothing that really wants to have a pair of Oni hit into it because of that number of cleave 2 attacks. Now, our second warband is led by an Oyabun. An Oyabun is basically just kind of a sister character to a daimyo. He is still somewhat dangerous in melee, but notably less dangerous than a daimyo. A daimyo has higher clash and cleave 2. The Oyabun has the Quicksilver Strikes rule, which is not particularly relevant on a profile like his. Lower clash and lower cleave, but still cleave 1. However, the big thing that the Oyabun does have is forward force, which gives flank to his regiment. Now, in this case, we have just 1 modular regiment in the Oyabun's warband, but it's very flexible because you can have any number, you just put modular regiments in any warband that they fit. You have near total flexibility to build lists because everything is effectively mainstay with the models that we have released presently in Yoroni. And he is leading another one of those Kami Kami Oni regiments. We've then got the Warlord, a Kitsune Bakasu. She is the melee Kitsune, so she's got 8 attacks at Clash 4 with Deadly Blades, which makes her a very dangerous character, basically comparable to the Daimyo. She's actually more dangerous on average against like a traditional kind of stat line, and she isn't susceptible to hardened, but Deadly Blades is one of those rules that results in peaks and troughs, and it's also susceptible to certain mechanical counters. If your opponent's got Tenacious, which is a common rule, or Untouchable, which is a semi-common rule, that significantly reduces the value of Deadly Blades and brings her more back in line with the Daimyo. The Daimyo, therefore, is more consistent. It's also a Ka character rather than Fu, I want to say the Kitsune is. But overall, both are very good combat beaters. Now, the Kitsune is kind of the go-to warlord choice right now for Yoroni, and I'm going to say I think all 3 Yoroni lists will be using the Kitsune as a warlord. Now, I do think that in some lists there is some merit towards an Oyabun warlord. The more I play against Yoroni, the more I find that they want to really time a shove into the enemy and are inevitably going to have situations where they extend certain things a little early. They are primarily a melee army, and being able to pick just one regiment every turn to gain hardened in particular, when so much of the army that you're playing is defense 4, is potentially very powerful. However, what the Kitsune allows is fluid formation, and fluid formation is one of the best rules in the game. Now, for most turns, that fluid formation is going to be gated to just the Kitsune's unit, because you need to be able to trigger the effects of a Fu card, and you need to be activating a regiment or character with the Fu ideal in order to trigger that, and the Kitsune and the Tengu are the only Fu regiments in this list. So for most turns, the Kitsune Supremacy is her unit will get fluid formation provided she has activated first. But on the Supremacy turn, you can have any one regiment get that benefit, and fluid formation once per turn anywhere in the list on that key turn is a really significant threat extender. Now, Saxon's Kitsune Bakusu has the Kenshibu Dancer rule, which means that whenever an enemy fails a defense saving throw against her, the wound inflicted counts as 2 for the purposes of morale tests. Now, what I am not actually sure about is how Kenshibu Dancer interacts with Deadly Blades, because Kenshibu Dancer says the wound inflicted, and Deadly Blades says defense rolls of a 6 inflict an additional wound. That one probably just has to go to the refs, but either way, she inflicts enough hits that Kenshibu Dancer will be useful. If the ruling is that Kenshibu Dancer doesn't interact at all with Deadly Blades, which might be the case, there is an argument for that rule to be on a daimyo instead, and Saxon does have 2 daimyos, but the way the rest of the list is configured, you wouldn't necessarily want to remove the Ignore Hindering Mastery from the daimyo because he's giving impact bonuses to his regiments, so this makes a degree of sense. The Kitsune, once again, is in that same unit as we've seen before, 2 Kami, 1 Oni, so we have the Oni for cleave and damage, the Kami for durability and trample, etc., etc. In her Warbind otherwise, we then have 2 Tengu Ayakashi regiments. These are the ranged Tengu, they're a bit more expensive than the melee ones. And in terms of everything they have going on, you can kind of think of them as a horizontally aligned chariot. The damage output is pretty similar, slightly higher on average and significantly higher if they get to aim. The mobility is higher because they can activate with a Fu card and get a 9-inch march. And the durability is sort of, it depends. You have only 8 wounds in the Tengu regiment, and while you do have Tenacious 1 against enemy range attacks, which adds up pretty fast, you don't have a Chariot's Hardened, and you don't have a Chariot's 10 wound count. You also degrade, because once you take those first 4 wounds, you'll lose a Tengu stand, whereas a Chariot is good all the way to dead. Chariots also have the hit and run ability, etc., but broadly the firepower can be considered kind of similar, which is pretty good firepower. The other thing that the Tengu do, which is very important in Yoroni, is that they give you turn 2 scenario scoring. Because they've got Vanguard, because they're fast, they can activate with a Fu card, these things can really, really motor up the field on turn 2, moving 4 plus 2 plus 7 plus 7 inches. So 20 inches up the field, which gets you into any large objective zone on the halfway line. So for example, zones in Maelstrom you can score on turn 2, similar like any of those scenarios. And it's very common to have scenarios that have got a large objective zone on the halfway line. If you don't have Tengu, you can't score those on turn 2. If you do have Tengu, then you can, and they're a range support and skirmish regiment, which is useful. After the second Tengu regiment, we've then got our 4th warband, which is a daimyo with nothing in a small modular regiment just of 2 kami. So this is the budget version of the Kami Kami Oni regiment. This list can't afford. It's not physically possible to get another Oni stand in there. It's 80 points per stand. So you're getting kind of the budget version here by having a daimyo providing the punch, and then 2 kami providing the durability. Now, before we do a broader analysis of that, let's just have a look at Reese's list, which is identical, except there are a couple of small differences. In Reese's list, the Kitsune is still the Warlord, but it has no upgrades. Instead, we can see those upgrades on other characters. The first is on an Oyabon, who has the Trial of Hakari Ishi. This is the 25-point upgrade that gives Tenacious 1 to a regiment, which, as you might imagine, when combined with a Defense 4 18-wound regiment, makes them very, very durable. The second notable difference is that rather than having 2 daimyo and 1 oyabun, Reese's list has 2 oyabun and 1 daimyo, which means that it does less damage when it connects in melee because an oyabun is relatively significantly less dangerous than a daimyo. Against a like classic defense 3 resolve 3 kind of target, the daimyo is almost half again as dangerous as an Oyaban, but the Oyaban has flank. And then finally, Reese has put the Kenshibu Dancer rule on a daimyo in the little Kami Kami regiment. So these are overall very small differences. Saxon's list has a daimyo with the ability to ignore hindering for his regiment. Reese's list has Tenacious on one of the larger bricks and has 2 Oyaban rather than 1 daimyo. Otherwise, every single regiment is identical. The configurations are identical. It's the same list. And that's frankly not hugely surprising, right? Right now, there are only a few regiment kits that are available. Kappa, the frog troops, are not yet available, and when they come out, they are actually built to add some really interesting versatility and regiment combinations into a list because they let you sort of like chop and change who you get the leader bonuses from. They're also quite nicely statted just for offense, etc. But right now, with the tools that are available, this is basically it. Like this is the really good Yoroni list, and it is really solid. Now there are a few things to look at, and then it's also kind of worth having just a little talk about flank math and why Reese versus Saxon, what the advantages and disadvantages of the 2 Oyabon versus 1 might be. So firstly, how is the list going to play? Well, it's one of those lists that is nothing but mediums all the way across the board. You see those occasionally, they do tend to be pretty rare, but they present a really interesting option because one of the things that they do is against a list that is really putting lots of lights on the table, you get to just completely be non-committal on the first turn against like a Nord player that is rushing all of the raiders on, or a Wadhrun player that is rushing slingers and hunting pack onto the table. You get to see where all of those are deployed before you commit anything, and then you respond by surging forward on turn 2. And in order to surge forward on turn 2, you want a reasonably consistent reinforcement curve. And both of the lists do it, but by taking 2 Oyabans, Reese's is a little more consistent. The kind of ideal in terms of what you're bringing on in turn 2 with these lists is you want to be bringing on usually 4 and ideally 5 regiments is kind of perfect. If you bring on 4 regiments, then you get 1 unit of Tengu if you need it, and at least 3 regiments with characters. If you bring on 5, then you get the 4th regiment with a character, which gives you more stall. It gives you potentially 4 points of stall, 4 stalling activations, before you have to commit a single unit to the table, which doubles down on the ability to refuse a flank, allocate force, overwhelm, whatever your plan is with your medium arrivals. What the flank does is it changes the odds basically of how those turns will play out. On turn 2, Reese's list has an 87% chance to bring on at least 4 regiments, and a 54% chance to hit that ideal of 5. Saxon's got a 65%-ish chance to bring on at least 4 regiments, and a 32% chance to bring on the 5, which is a notable turn 2 difference, but by turn 3 things tend to equalize out, because anything that you didn't roll 4 on turn 2, you'll be rolling 4 on turn 3, and so there's only a 22% chance that by turn 3, flank will have affected your overall activation counts. But turn 2 is very important, and how you appear on turn 2 is very important, and so flank kind of makes that difference. Also, that 22% chance that flank won't matter by turn 3, well, flank will matter by turn 3 rather, means that about 1 game in 5, you have the situation where, oh no, flank mattered quite a lot. And so probably the best actual way, setting aside all of the percentages, etc., the best actual way to describe the difference between 2 daimyo, 1 Oyaban versus 1 Oyaban, 2 daimyo is that with 1 Oyaban and 2 daimyo, in a 5-round event, you will have, generally speaking, 2 games where you have a reinforcement curve that is a little bit trickier. With the extra Oyaban, you will have 1 game instead. So Reese is likely to run into 1 game where he has a reinforcement curve that requires a bit of thought and might be a little bit difficult and presents kind of a novel situation. Saxon is likely to run into 2 of those games rather than 1. So in Saxon's case, with Saxon's list, probably in 2 games out of 5, you'll have a situation where, okay, the reinforcement curve's a bit skewy, how do I play around this? And that's pretty significant. However, in the games where Saxon's list just sort of performs to spec, or even is a little bit lucky on the reinforcement rolls, the offensive difference between an Oyaban and a daimyo matters. It matters a lot. It doesn't just, so the daimyo is almost 50% more dangerous against quite a lot of targets than the Oyaban. But also, the Oyaban doesn't add anything in terms of Yoroni cards to his regiment. He's Chi, and the Kami-led regiments are Chi, and you can't double down on those abilities. The Daimyo lets you go car benefit from him, chi benefit from activating the regiment with its own card, which means that the Daimyo's regiments much of the time will also have +1 impact attack and +1 brutal impact. So Saxon's list has gone for significantly more, not significantly, but more mechanical strength when things go right. And Reese's list has gone for more consistency. Your call as to which of those is better in a 5-round event, right? There is a strong argument for consistency. There's also a strong argument for just more mechanical power. I would also make the case that Reese's decision to put Dancer on a Daimyo is particularly appealing because it avoids having to answer the question of how Deadly Blades interacts with that rule. Overall, though, these are really solid lists. They are making one notable concession, and that is that for characters, like 500 points in these lists is being spent on characters. And that is something of a necessary concession because Yoroni don't like being radically out-activated. It's not that they are like hugely vulnerable to it. They can do things like there are playstyles in Yoroni, and indeed these lists have that playstyle. You have durable regiments that can take a punch, that have long threat range because of things like the Fu card, March Charges, etc. The list has all of the tools to play around being out-activated in the rare case that your opponent has more than 12 activations. But because one of the big draws of Yoroni is the flexibility of their command stack, the ability to alter your activation plan on the fly if you need to, a lot of the more material benefits of that are kind of lost if your opponent significantly out-activates you, because you can't time your last and your first and your middle. Like all of the activation advantage that you have begins to recede a little bit, right? Like the flexibility advantage you have begins to recede a little bit if your opponent just has a bunch more cards than you, and you don't have the opportunity to take advantage of all of the parts of the turn, early, middle, and late. So we see 4 characters in these lists, because despite costing 110 points, that's still the cheapest activation that you can get in Yoroni. So we've got the Kitsunes, the Oyabans, the Daimyos. Now, fortunately, all of them are very good characters, and the regiments that they are in are very, very durable. And so in both these cases, these are both very good players. It'll be very interesting to see how they perform. I'll also be very interested to see if I get a chance to play against either of them, because it's just super interesting to see how Yoroni perform in a competitive environment. Now, as a bit of an outlier, we have our third Yoroni list. This is Daniel's bird-heavy Yoroni, and it is different. Firstly, it has the most scuffed points cost I have ever seen in a list. Good lord, 1975 points is cursed, but I am very willing to believe that it's just not possible. Because Yoroni disciplines are gated behind character types, etc., he's put an upgrade on every character. I don't think there's much he can do in terms of changing this, unless he cuts certain significant things, but yeah, wow, that stings to leave 25 points on the table. However, what we've got here is a Kitsune Bakasu Warlord, same as in the other 2 lists. Yes, it's very powerful. In this list in particular, it is the very obvious choice, because there are a lot of Fu activations in this list. So, in her warband, we have 2 Tengu Akeyashi. That's the ranged unit. 3 Tengu Bushi, seeing that for the first time. That is the melee Tengu unit. On these guys, not hugely durable. Relative to the points cost, we have just Defense 3, Resolve 3, which is fine, but these are 75 point stands with only 5 wounds. Again, 5 wounds is fine, but 75 wounds a stand. However, in exchange for that relative limited durability, we get 6 attacks per stand with Flawless Strikes at Clash 3, and they ignore hindering, and they have flight, and they have vanguard. So this is a very aggressive potential unit, unlike the Tengu Akeyashi, who will, run forward and get onto objective zones, but are a bit fragile when they get there. This unit can potentially brawl and threaten more. It's also, because it's a native Fu regiment, outside of the Kitsune Supremacy turn, it can get fluid formation, etc. We've then got an absolute brick shithouse of a regiment in the form of 5 Kami Akeyashi. So these gain the defense 4, evasion 2. This is a 30 wound regiment that presumably the Kitsune is joining, since she has the Hachiwa mastery that lets them ignore the effects of hindering terrain. Now, I'm going to say I think this this lineup is potentially a little bit of a mistake. I think you are leaving a little bit of money on the table by not having just at least one Oni in there. One Oni gives you one stand with a bunch of cleave to attacks, and yes, you don't have trample, but that's a lot of additional potential damage. However, frankly, it might not be necessary, and if the role of this regiment is just to death ball up and run into the enemy, well, 10 trample hits is 10 trample hits. In Warband 2, we then have a Daimyo, and this is the first time we see the Way of the Kensai Mastery. This is a very expensive, possibly too expensive, but it has to be this expensive not to be grotesque, mastery. It does two things. The first thing is it gives Quicksilver Strike, which is normally a useless ability. However, the second thing it does is mean that your opponents cannot decline duels. And when put on a model like a Daimyo or a Kitsune, you have a model that can reliably chop the head off many enemy characters before they have a chance to respond, and who can't decline duels. I have played against this kind of a setup exactly once, and it literally zoned an entire regiment of mine back toward the back table edge for multiple turns in a row until I could deal with that regiment and that character, because of the threat of just, no, your character's dead. Whoomp, all of the things they offered are gone, you don't get any response, they're just dead, I just had to roll some dice, goodbye now. Now, it's a 40-point mastery, and if we look at the rest of the list, we can see that there are 40 points plus 25 points that just haven't been spent. If you were to cut that and cut some extra, like cut down mastery here or there, you'd get a whole extra stand in the regiment, but this is a terrifying thing to play against, and if you're playing against this daimyo, you will need to account for that threat. Now, he is most likely in a regiment of 3 Tengu Bushi, so those are the melee Tengu again. This is not a hugely durable regiment, but it's a very fast regiment. It can do things like move 9 inches, and then charge 7 plus d6 inches, and then have the daimyo activate and duel, and potentially for devastating results. Now, there's a very small disadvantage of putting the daimyo in this regiment, which is that the regiment will lose flight. That's not the end of the world. Flight is a very nice rule to have, but giving it up doesn't actually hugely change how the regiment moves in many cases. You can just kind of account for that, particularly given that a lot of other things in this regiment have flight because they're comprised entirely of Tengu. He's then got another Tengu Akayashi pair, and then finally we have a second Kitsune Bakusu, so the melee Kitsune. This one has the Gunbai Mastery, which gives forward force to the regiment for 30 points. And it looks like she is also in a 3 Tengu Bushi regiment, also with a 2 Tengu Akayashi regiment around. So that is a colossal number of Tengu. I think this entire list is comprised entirely of characters Tengu and then the 1 Kami brick, which means that it is hugely mobile. It is almost entirely Fu activatable, so you can have fluid formation almost wherever you need it on plenty of 4 wide regiments. You've also got 4 of those paired regiments of Tengu Akayashi, which is a lot of skirmish poke. Tengu Akayashi can be a little vulnerable to certain kinds of enemy counter barrage, anything that can overcome the Tenacious One, for example, but when you have that many of them, you genuinely do have the ability to leap on the enemy and really do some damage. The whole list is moving forward very quickly, the whole list is very dangerous. And because the list is only playing 3 characters, it gets just a few more points to spend on regiments rather than characters if we compare it to Reese's and Saxon's list. Now, the cost of that is that it is only an 11 activation list. You can't get to 12 activations really easily and have good quality units without going to that 4th character, but with the caveat that it is 11 activations, and it is fragile outside of the Kami brick, because Tengu are just not quite particularly durable. It presents very interesting threats, it presents very different threats, and it promises to play very differently to Reese and Saxon's list. So definitely another list to watch, although I genuinely could not tell you how this will play. It is so fast and so weird and so mobile, I'm going to have to just see how it goes on the day if I play against it. Very, very interesting list though from Daniel, very cool to see. Now, jumping next into Wadhrun, we have 2 Wadhrun players. The first of these is Mitch, and this is his Matriarch Queen-led Wadhrun list. Now, Matriarch Queen as a warlord is a little bit off meta, and I do think there is a little bit of a weakness with how Mitch has chosen sort of to configure this list, because he's taken the Matriarch Queen as an Apex Master, which means she's riding an Apex Predator, which kind of removes the important half of her supremacy. So there are two parts of the Matriarch Walks, her supremacy. The first is always active. When a regiment chants the battle cry of any cult, it loses the broken status. That's nice, it's a good thing to have. Being able to unbreak your regiments as they activate, that's cool. However, the more important part of her ability is her activated ability, which is that once per battle, the Matriarch Queen can activate the supremacy ability. All regiments currently in the battlefield have their command stand count as +2 stands for purposes of seizing. That lets light regiments seize. The time when it is most important for light regiments to seize is on turn 2, because they'll be on the board, they'll be in zones, etc. And she can't be on the board on turn 2, which means she can't use the activated part of the supremacy, which means that in effect, actually, the earliest time she can use the supremacy, to my understanding, is turn 4, because she'll arrive on turn 3 and use the supremacy on turn 4. If you want to use this ability to let light score, she has to be in a light regiment that arrives on turn 1, and she's riding a dinosaur in this particular case. She's riding a T-Rex. Now, the Matriarch Queen riding a T-Rex is really cool, but it does mean that this list looks like it has light scoring, but actually doesn't. Now, in her warband otherwise, we've got one MSU of Blooded. Blooded, I think, are kind of also a little bit of an off-meta pick. Blooded and Braves cost exactly the same amount of points. Blooded have got one more attack and Braves have a shield. That's literally the only difference. And for my money, of the two, the shields are a little bit better, but ultimately, if you've got one painted and not the other, that's totally fine. We then got a unit of Warbred. Again, just an MSU. Perfectly serviceable regiment, not taken in many Wadhrun lists because they don't have synergy with the most common warlords. Warlord lists are kind of segmented by their warlords Wadhrun lists are segmented by their warlords quite a lot, but in this case, because you're taking the Matriarch Queen as the warlord, there's not any particular pro or con to Warbred, and so you can take Warbred just because they're a good stat stick. We then got the Apex Predator that Matriarch Queen is riding. In Warband 2, we then have a Mounted Predator with Death's Reach. Death's Reach makes the Mounted Predator really quite a good mounted melee character, in addition to having a decent range attack, and the Mounted Predator will be in an MSU of Raptor Riders. Now, this unit is fragile, but it's very flexible. It's only Evasion 2, Evasion 2, Resolve 3, 5 wounds apiece, but it's got a lot of choices in how it can play. Generally speaking, in any given turn, you'll have to pick one free action. You'll have to pick either the free shot from Mounted Hunters or the free reform from Fluid Formation, but in any given case, either of those is potentially really good. You'll then have your 2 normal activations. The ranged attack, you'll have the Mounted Predator's assistance. The Fluid Formation, you'll have 4 regiments to make some really good charges, and because of the ability of the Mounted Predator, all of the regiments in its warband will ignore hindering. Now, light regiments don't suffer particularly much from hindering in any case, but I definitely, for some reason, thought they had impacts and they don't. So yeah, completely irrelevant there, other than the fact that the Mounted Predator is adding quite a lot just offensively to the regiment. It's also going to mean that ignoring hindering applies to some of the other things in her regiment, which are more significant. We've then got a Hunting Pack. Yep, Hunting Pack, good. Part of the light presence that you can bring on with Wadhrun. So in this case, we'll probably expect to see things like the Raptor Riders and the Hunting Pack like arrive early, work together, etc. And they are a mainstay that unlock the 2 remaining restricted slots in the warband, which are another Apex Predator and a Quattle. Finally, we have a Chieftain who is a Tontor rider. He has a little MSU of veterans, perfectly serviceable infantry, and then the Tontor that he is riding. So that means we've got 2 characters on big dinosaurs, basically big, stompy, and then a bunch of stuff that's around and supporting that. Now, if I'm being kind of brutally honest, this is the Wadhrun list that you play when you painted your Wadhrun in 2023. It's not really making super full use of the various different changes that Wadhrun have seen in the most recent update. And it's probably going to struggle a little bit with its reinforcement curve. Because it has so many heavy regiments, right? There's a Tontor and 2 Apex Predators. It's going to be very easy for this list to have a situation where the best thing for it to do is to actually hold the Mounted Predator back early. Just do not bring them on. If the Hunting Pack turns up, be non-committal with that, because this list has to wait for everything to arrive. It's going to have multiple heavies. There's only about a 1 in 2 chance of you getting even 2 heavies on turn 3. There's no flank or anything on any of your mediums, so there's a good chance that you might have a medium that's waiting to arrive until turn 4 as well. And that's fine, because things like the Blooded, if they arrive late, is totally okay, but it means that you are just not going to have particularly many activations on the board, which means your opponent can play around you and respond to you easily. And when, say, the model like the Quattle turns up, the Quattle is really fast, it's really dangerous, it's really cool, it adds to kind of like a ranged style of play. And you can do cool things like combine that with the actual range attacks from the Raptor Riders. Take range attacks, pull back, that kind of thing. Like move forward, shoot, move back. That is a viable play for Raptor Riders. You can do something kind of similar. You've got good range on the Quaddle. So you can poke and you can prod, but I think the list has to do that. I think this list it's not thick enough in the early parts of the game to extend forward, which means it must play harassing and it can't really score during that time. Right? The Quaddle is going to be the first regiment on the table that can score zones. And if you want it to get onto zones in many scenarios, you actually have to set an aggressive reinforcement line with the Raptor Riders because the Hunting Pack are irregular. And so there's just this, there is potential in the early game, but it is going to, it'll be in a situation where if your opponent's early game is like present but a little weak, you can bully them just a little bit with your early game until the heavies arrive. But if your opponent's early game is strong, or if your opponent's early game is kind of like non-existent and they will surge like Yoroni, your plan kind of changes to be contingent on wait for your heavies to arrive, wait for the Tauntaur to turn up, wait for the Apexes to turn up, have your healing online with the Matriarch Queen, do things like heal the Tauntaur, etc. And that can really mean that your list's plan is going to be a little more contingent than you might like on reinforcement rolls, and sometimes will just require patience, because if you overextend any of those early regiments with this list, they'll get chewed up far too easily. There aren't enough of them to present target saturation, and the Raptor Riders, right, the Hunting Pack, these units are not durable. They're not hugely weak, like loose formation, fluid formation, and loose formation. Loose formation in particular helps the Hunting Pack a fair bit. But if you extend these guys into like good offensive magic or a good gun line, they're going to get chewed up because you can't overwhelm early. And that's fine, but it means that you are relying on the late arrivals, and the late arrivals in this case could be very late. It is possible for this list to not be fully present until turn 5, and that's a challenging, and that's probably going to happen at least one game in 5. That's something that Mitch is going to have to play around and presents a challenge. And so despite the fact that Wadhrun have been performing very well overall competitively since the update, this is a list I think Mitch is going to have to work pretty hard to do well with. Now, our next Wadhrun player has a list that is a little bit more cohesive in terms of its plan. This is Alex's list. Alex is a player from Canberra, and one of the things we'll see about this list is that it has a very strong heavy presence, which is not itself actually particularly common for like meta Wadhrun. Thunder Riders are common and strong, but if you look at many of the scariest Wadhrun lists, you will see things that are a bit more early and like mid-game oriented and attempting to get up the field much more aggressively. This list compromises on that very slightly in order to have many powerful heavy regiments, but a big difference between Alex's and Mitch's list is that Alex's list is often going to be fully present on turn 3, thanks to the presence of a bunch of flank. So we're starting with a Winglord Predator. This will be the first of 3 Quattles in the list. We then have a Hunting Pack and a Quattle. Our Warlord is then a Thunder Chieftain. And this presently is pretty much the most common warlord in Wadhrun because he gives bonuses, he gives shock to Speaker's regiments, and it's very easy to have a list that is predominantly comprised of Speaker's regiments who will benefit well from this ability. It's just kind of the easiest warlord to have always active and always doing something in Wadhrun. He's got Resilience and Kiss of the Dealersaur. Kiss of the Dealersaur is all of the hits that he inflicts. Your opponent has to reroll successful defense rolls, and given that he has good clash attacks and trample and good impact attacks, you can really make a lot of use of that in one turn. Resilience is the mastery that gives Thunder Riders Hardened 1. And there are 2 Thunder Rider regiments. Thunder Riders don't really need an introduction, especially Conquest Thunder Riders, and he does as the Warlord follow the Cult of Conquest. These things, if you line your chants up correctly, have a 19-inch march charge threat, and they will crush things that they land. That 19-inch threat is very challenging to play against in many cases. It lets them push forward aggressively and then do an absolute ton of damage on the connection. The restricted slots in the warband are then filled out by another Quattle, that's the 3rd bird in the list, and a Tauntaur. And this was kind of the challenge that the list was posed. I actually gave Alex a hand writing this list, and the question they put to me was, can we get a Tauntaur into this list and still have it do things? And yes, you can fit a Tauntaur in, but the really important thing here is that although there are 3 heavies, 2 of them have flank, which means on turn 3, you pick your Tauntaur as your auto-arriving regiment and your Thunder Riders as your 2 flanks. And what that means is that even if the list is not hugely on the field on turn 3, it is hugely on the field by the end of turn 3. All of these regiments, like a Tauntaur with shock, presents a colossal amount of threat. It's very durable, it's very dangerous, like etc., etc. And you have that and 2 Thunder Riders and the Thunder Chieftain all turning up, that allows you to either stack a flank or push broadly across a pair of horns. It's very strong. Now, rounding out the list, we have sort of the rest of Wadhrun good stuff, which is a Predator, no upgrades, inner unit of Slingers, and a Hunting Pack. Now, this marks this as the only unit of Slingers that is in any of the Wadhrun lists, which is, that's fine, that's the thing. Slingers are a very good regiment. It's a bit of an over-under as to whether or not you think that they are too good. Frankly, the free space on Wadhrun chat bingo right now is how many days it has been since someone mentioned that the winning list at Adepticon did not have any Slingers, therefore there is no need whatsoever for them to see any balance adjustments. But regardless of your opinion on them, particularly with singing bullets, Slingers are very good. They are the important part of the early game presence of Wadhrun, right? Whereas Raptor Riders present kind of an interesting hybrid threat, Slingers are ranged. They are ranged with a long threat range and a lot of damage that they can put out at long range, thanks to 18 inches, always in effective range, etc. off of the barrage. And it's their presence that helps maximize Hunting Pack, because they give the army a regiment that Hunting Pack can screen and protect, which gives you kind of like a really nice closed loop of early game. Now, with all of the heavies, right, 2 regiments of Thunder Riders, 1 Tontor, there is a regiment that is notably absent, right? There is one regiment that I would consider to be a key part of the Wadhrun good stuff mix that's not present here, and that is Chosen of Conquest. Chosen of Conquest with a Scion of Conquest are an expensive addition to Wadhrun. Neither of those, it's not a cheap character, and it's not a cheap unit. But having them present gets you more Conquest chant markers on the board, and gives you access to the Chosen of Conquest and their Conquest chant, which gives them an extra action. And there is no rule in the game, basically, that is as powerful as an unfettered additional action. They are very, very powerful. They're very expensive, so you would expect that. And if you compare this list to, say, Wadhrun Adepticon lists, that's the actual regiment that you will see. You will notice its absence the most. That is the price that needed to be paid to get the extra unit of Thunder Riders and the extra Tontor into the list, that massive amount of weight that is arriving on turn 3 to bull into and then over the top of the enemy. Now, to put it bluntly, this is a list that kind of terrifies me. This list has 1,000 points of Linebreaker stuff in it, for example, and I'm playing 100 Kingdoms, which means that all of my defense relies on shields. And it also kind of presents just like this level of heavy threat is something that Conquest generally has been pushing away from for a little while. The game has gotten more and more focused on the early game and early scoring, and I think it's very possible to critique that, right? Like, I think there's a player focus on the early game that maybe we would collectively benefit from just reining in a little bit, like critically assessing whether or not those are actually the most powerful lists, or if we're trapped in a closed circuit symmetrical arms race. But kind of regardless of whether or not it is objectively the best to really, really rush early game and really, really focus on early scoring, that's how people are playing with many of their lists these days, ever since sort of like the Nord update, Wadhrun update, the changes to the supremacy role. And so it's just kind of rare to see a list that does this, where it's like, oh, there's 1,000 points arriving on turn 3. You going to deal with that? And so I'm interested to see how Alex plays against it. I think if they and I play, there is a very good chance I've crafted a rod for my own back, because particularly with resilience on the Thunder Riders, when we come and see my list, you'll see a lot of Cleave 1 and AP 1. And so much hardened on so many wounds with such a long threat range is a bit of an existential problem for me, but that's totally okay. One of the very interesting matchups that might occur, and I would be interested to see, is how this list, for example, plays into Yoroni, because in that case we have something of an immovable object, unstoppable force situation, where the Yoroni are very durable and present some really interesting bricks. But are those bricks durable enough to stand up to Thunder Riders straight to the dome? Well, they probably are, but not without casualties, and then how do they capitalize on that? It's just going to be interesting to see how matchups like that play, because you have these big, heavy, weighty regiments that are being slung around on both sides, and in all cases, it's like, I don't 100% know who wins those individual fights. So if I get a chance, if I have, for example, a game that finishes early or a bye round, and I see Alex playing against any of the Yoroni players, I'd be particularly interested to watch that game, and overall I think this is a list that's just mechanically very scary. Now, up next we have Spires, and somewhat frustratingly, notwithstanding my previous statement that there was one Spires player, I have just been sent a text list which I've recreated in PDF by the tournament organizer that wasn't included in the original PDF package that was sent through to me. I think this is actually the 22nd player, so the player count is correct. Just if you want to mentally go back to that slide that covered the player breakdown, if those math numbers didn't add up, this is why. So we actually have 2 Spires players, and the first of those is Lachlan. Now, Spires are very heavily affected. The list build will change significantly based on what sub-faction you are playing, and with a Biomancer Warlord, this is a Directorate list. Directorate adds a couple of things. Firstly, it adds a once per round burnout that you can apply to any regiment, very commonly applied to things like Siegebreakers, for example, or it's not bad on stuff like Centaur Avatara. And secondly, it gives the Biomancer access to the subdermal keratin induction, which allows light regiments to be counted as medium purposes of scoring, and usually the Biomancer will be the Warlord, which means they can target any friendly regiment in a scenario zone regardless of distance. So to start with, we have a Lineage Prideborn with Adaptive Sensors. Adaptive Sensors is the mutation that says the enemy can't use their evasion attribute to make defense saves against you. And particularly when combined with AP2 Deadly Shot attacks, if you're playing against stuff like Moroi or Kerez, for example, Old Dominion Ghosts, anything with a decent evasion score, that's a nice thing to have to round out a list to 2,000 points. We've then got a unit of 3 Centaur Avatara with a Standard Bearer, 3 Centaur Avatara with a Standard Bearer, and 3 Leonine Avatara. So double heavies here and then 1 medium. It is most likely, not certain, but most likely that the Lineage Prideborn herself will be in the Leonine Avatara since she supplements its range damage output well. We then have a Biomancer. This is an Avatar Projection Biomancer, which is not common, and I'll talk why in a second, but not necessarily bad. Avatar Projection and Flesh Carver. Now, the more common loadout, meta-wise, for a Biomancer is to just take Master of Flesh and plonk the Biomancer in just some little unit somewhere, where he operates purely as a support character. Does 2 Biomancies and 2 character actions a turn. The character actions usually you don't get 2 good ones, but the 2 Biomancies let you do a variety of different things. However, there is a second way to run a Biomancer, and that is this loadout. And I actually genuinely personally prefer it, but it does lock you into a heavy regiment with the Biomancer. And by locking the Biomancer into a heavy regiment, we give up turn 2 scoring with our lights, which you kind of need to account for with the rest of the list. Anyway, we'll talk about that when we get to the heavy regiment that he will inevitably be in. For now, Force-Grown Drones, Catabolic Node, yep, cool. It's a light regiment and it explodes when it dies. We've then got an MSU of Desolation Drones, who are a serviceable range unit. They don't often do much damage themselves, despite AP1 and Deadly Shot, because their range is a little low and their volley is not that low. But whenever they hit something, they apply a penalty to enemy defense, which can work very well, in particular things like the Centaur Avatara. You don't obviously need to combine reprocessing agents with a Siegebreaker Behemoth, because it has Smite. But when you have regiments that inflict lots of individual hits, Marksman Clone, Centaur Avatara, that's when the Desolation Drones become really good. We've then got a Siegebreaker Behemoth and the expected brick of Incarnate Sentinels, 4 Incarnate Sentinels that the Biomancer will be joining. Now, he joins them because he's made into a brute by Avatar Projection, and their wound count of 6 is why Flesh Carver is very, very important. You need to be able to restore a regiment with at least half health. If you restore a stand, it has to come back with at least half health. And the Biomancer, although it has 2 different sources of healing, each of them individually without Flesh Carver is too small to recover an Incarnate Sentinel. With Flesh Carver, plus 1 heal per instance of healing, you can now, usually what will happen is if you're down an Incarnate Sentinel, you will top the regiment up to full with your draw event, Biotic Renewal, and then with Mending Touch, or whatever it's called, you will restore a 3 health Incarnate Sentinel. And so, although the regiment's resolve is a little bit of a weak point, he can keep this regiment just going and going and going. He can also push them up to Defense 5 with one of his Biomancies. So this is a regiment that I have personally used in lists, and if you put it in the right place at the right time, it just grinds out flanks, provided you put it in a situation where it isn't exposed to overwhelming firepower. If that is the case, it can just push and push and push and move from each fight to the next with full health. You need to have the list that supports that kind of play. And if you are running a Biomancer Warlord army, the problem with this is that you don't have access to subdermal keratin induction on turn 2, so you can't score on turn 2 with that particular Biomancy. But if you have some plan for managing that, and I would posit that this list does, then you get a really cool active Warlord out of what otherwise would be a very passive character. And we can see that plan for managing that with the final Warband. High Clone Executor. He has no upgrades, and he will probably be playing in a unit of Vanguard clones. He'll be bringing them onto the field probably on turn 2, and with Vanguard they'll be running forward into objective zones. Now they can't reach every objective zone in the game, but they can reach a fair few, and some of the ones that he can't, you actually sometimes can with Fluid Formation on Leonine Avatara. And so, although it's a little thin, this list has a plan for scoring turn 2. The warband is rounded out with an MSU of marksman clones, which, as noted, sort of they combine nicely with things like the Desolation drones. And so, in total, this gives us a list that is very heavy on the heavies for Spires, but has kind of an interesting plan to play around that. It's got a little formation, like if you look at those mediums, right, there are 3 mediums in the list, which means that about half the time you'll have 2 of them present, which means you can do things like you can bring on the Vanguard clones and bring on the Leonine behind them, and just have just a little bunker that can occupy part of the table, and that's totally fine. Sorry, you'll often bring, yeah, because you've got marksman clones as well, sorry. So you have enough mediums in the list to usually bring on 2 on turn 2, which gives you a little bunker. It'll usually be the Leonine and the Vanguard much of the time. Just occupy part of the table until the heavies arrive, and you have 4 heavy regiments. Now, 4 heavy regiments, very close to, doesn't guarantee, but it gives you a very good chance that one of them isn't arriving until turn 5. But with Centaur Avatara, they are at least speed 8, which means that if they arrive, they can arrive and potentially shift the battle where they arrive. Now, that is a challenge. You are going to be playing 200 points down for a large part of the game. The payoff for that is that a lot of the rest of the list is just very high quality. You have a Siegebreaker Behemoth, which is probably the best unit in the army to use the Burnout Draw event on, since it costs almost nothing, increases speed and clash. You have the big Incarnate Brick. You'll usually be arriving with two heavies will usually arrive on turn 3, and then 1 or 2 will arrive on turn 4. Sometimes you'll have one coming on turn 5. The pattern, I would imagine, will often be Incarnates and the Siegebreaker on turn 3, and then 1 or 2 Centaur Avatara on turn 4. This does make it a slightly slower burn list, but you've got just enough mediums to fight over a little part of the table, and if your opponent's early pressure is not overwhelming, they can just move and take a little bit of ground while the rest of the list arrives. And they will need to, that level of caution will need to be exercised. This list is likely to be playing a little bit behind on scenario for some of the game until all of the heavies can arrive and take over the pace of the game and etc. But once they do, they move very quickly. They're dangerous and they play well together with internal synergies. The Siegebreaker Behemoth combines very well with the Army special rule for Burnout. The Centaur Avatara combine very nicely with both the Leonine and the Desolation drones. You've got quite good threat ranges if you're willing to take some burnout damage on Centaur Avatara, for example, because they can march charge 20 plus rerollable d6 if you want to burn out with them, and they'll have Clash 4 impact attacks. Now, you don't want to do that often, but it's an option that lets you get back into the game with long threat ranges, and is one of the few cases of a unit that can out-threaten, for example, Thunder Riders in melee. And so, although it is kind of off meta relative to what we would sort of consider, we would probably consider normal competition Spires to be a bit more light and medium oriented, maybe 1 heavy early game focus, subdermal keratin induction, directorate Spires. That would be what I would consider to be kind of like normal competitive Spires, possibly with a lot of marksman clones. That's something that we're seeing a lot these days, like 3 or more regiments of marksman clones, no Centaur and Leonine Avatara. This is a list that is competently put together, like very competently put together, and flips that script a little, and gives up almost entirely on the very early game while still having a plan for scoring on turn 2 and scoring on 3 in part of the board. So the goal of this list will be to not fall significantly behind on scenario, using pieces like the Vanguards and the Leonine, and then aggressively push and take the game over with the weight of heavies as and when they arrive. There will be some games over the course of a 5-round event where too much stuff is off the board until turn 5, and if that happens in a scenario that you can't recover, that might present a challenge for the list. But if that doesn't happen, or if Lachlan can play through it, this is a very nicely put together, heavy focused Spires list, and I think I like it compared to probably any of the other ways you might choose to run this many heavies in Spires. If you want to commit yourself to this many heavies, and you're comfortable playing Directorate, like you're not a newer player, I think this is probably the way to do it, once you've made the decision that the light and medium spam meta is not for you. Now, our second Spires list is Rupert, and I actually don't think I know this player. I'm not sure I've had a chance to meet Rupert, but I am reliably informed that the army is very pretty. This is the army, I believe, that won Best Painted at CanCon this year, so I'm looking forward very much to seeing it in person. But I will say I suspect from how this list is constructed that there are some accommodations either to hobby or to theme that are maybe a small step away from competitive optimization. This is an all brutes, all cav, all monsters, nothing small, all large boys Spires list. And I think as far as these lists go, it has the advantage of being a little simpler to play, a little easier to run. There are consistently higher speed values across the board because there is nothing that is infantry, and it's usually infantry that is the slowest stuff in Spires, even if Spires infantry is sometimes fast. But I don't think this is a hugely competitively optimized list. Once you commit to the bit though, once you say there is nothing in this list that is infantry sized, this is a pretty serviceable way of doing it within Spires, and it is unsurprisingly a sovereign lineage list, which means we're looking at the army bonus being superior creations, which allows you to make a small number of models in the list plus one clash up to a maximum of 3. Now, there are not many things that actually really hugely benefit from this. In order to apply superior creations, a model basically needs to be clash 2, because paying 5 points per stand to improve the clash of force-grown drones is a fool's errand. And the list of models that are Clash 2 Inspires, where it is worth paying 5 points because they will be in close combat making clashes, is very small. It's basically just Avatara, or potentially Leonine Avatara if something has gone terribly wrong. And so that means that really the benefit of playing the Sovereign Lineage is access to the Lineage Highborn as a Warlord, which does give you a big chunk of free points, which is always a nice thing to have, but you don't have the same interlocking complexity and play opportunities that are presented by Ferromancers and Biomancers. So some limitations are baked into this list, but with that said, let's go through it. So we've got 2 identical warbands as our first 2 warbands. Each consists of a Lineage Prideborn with no upgrades, a unit of Leonine Avatara with superior creations, and a unit of Centaur Avatara with a Standard Bearer. Now, I can think of probably a few things I would rather spend the points on in a Spires list than putting superior creations on Leonine Avatara. In my experience, if Leonine Avatara are in close combat, then something has gone horribly wrong. But I should probably caveat that with, I will usually run a more traditional Spires list. I will have infantry. The Leonine Avatara will be sitting behind the infantry shooting over their heads. This list doesn't have that luxury. This list is committed to a certain bit. And having committed to that bit, the Leonine will not have the same screening opportunities they would have in a more cosmopolitan Spires list. So they may have situations where they're in combat, and they may have situations where you're even doing things like shooting and then charging, because a Leonine Avatara unit can actually go up to Impact 4 if it charges a target that it shot. Now, is this better than aiming and shooting? Actually, yes, very slightly if you've paid for superior creations. It is genuinely a little bit better, but it's still also a tactic that I would typically expect to be kind of last resort. Still, Leonine Avatara are good whether you're paying for superior creations or not. Centaur Avatara are very good. Moving on into then we have just one more warband, which is the Lineage Highborn warband. The Lineage Highborn has the expected loadout, which is Cascading Degeneration, Command Pheromones, and Ferromantic Override. You get all of these for free as a result of Legacies of the Ark Supremacy ability. And even if we consider that Ferromantic Override is maybe slightly overcosted, that's still 80 to 100 points of free stuff, and that's 80 to 100 points of free stuff. Now from here we have 2 Superior Creations units of Avatara. However, it's very unlikely. Those Avatara will be fighting solo by themselves, the Lineage will not joining them. It will instead be joining a nice solid 4 block of Incarnate Sentinels. Finally, we round the list out with a Siegebreaker Behemoth. Now, this means this is our second Spires list with 4 heavies. It's got no lights and 4 mediums, and no flank. So this is probably going to be the slowest list onto the board that we will see today, I expect. And one of the changes I would probably suggest immediately is, unless the author of this list is genuinely expecting to make shoot charge action combinations with the Leonine Avatara regularly, if that is not something that happens regularly, if your Leonine are not in combat regularly, cut all of the superior creations off the Leonine and add Attracting Pheromones Mastery to the Lineage Highborn, and then use the remaining 10 points for like Eagle Eye on a Lineage Prideborn or something. And what this would do is give you flank on one of your heavies. Now, flank and early arrival, etc., is not the be-all and end-all. There are games that you can absolutely play by slow rolling your arrival, just holding some territory early, moving, expanding from there, bringing on a big heavy presence that lets you snowball through the game and get to turn 10 in a winning position. But this list, I feel, with the way that the reinforcement rolls are likely to roll over the course of a 5-round event, there are going to be games where this list is late onto the table, and the things that are arriving early don't necessarily want to fight together. The Leonine Avatara and the regular Avatara are what passes for early scoring, and the Avatara can get 14 inches up, the Leonine can get 14 plus fluid formation, you can get onto zones. But with the uncertainty that you will get from just hard rolling all of your reserve rolls, all mediums, all heavies, I feel like there are just going to be games where it is difficult to make a plan because the reserve rolls for your mediums will get you a couple of units onto the board. And then if your turn 3 reserve rolls crap out and you've extended your, maybe you bring on a Lineage Prideborn and a unit of Leonine Avatara and 1 unit of Avatara as your turn 2 arrivals, and you push them forward 14 inches, and then everything just kind of fails on you and all you have is your Incarnate Brick. Well, your Incarnate Brick can arrive to potentially relieve the Lineage unit, but there's too much potential for catastrophic failure here. For a plan that you make that then just doesn't get delivered on because there's no consistency anywhere in the reserve rolls. Flank is an expensive and powerful ability for a reason. One of the few advantages that Spires have in terms of where they sit in the current army cycle is that they are the only faction in the game that gets to pay 20 points for flank on any character. I expect that to actually go away when they get reworked, but while you've got it, you may as well have it. And it's not that I am of the opinion that you must get your entire army onto the board as quickly as possible. That is an option that you have in Conquest, but it's not necessarily mandatory if you know how to play different outcomes of your reinforcement curve. But I feel like there is so much variability in this list's reinforcement curve that the plan the list is actually making is, well, look, everything is superior creations, everything can fight if it needs to, there is no individual regiment in this list that needs to operate necessarily mutually supporting, so it's a bunch of individual hero regiments that you're all kind of hoping do okay, and my personal experience with Avatara, for example, is that they don't. Every time I have put regular Avatara on the table, they have completely failed relative to their points cost, superior creations or no. That's probably a personal failing, but this feels like a list where that option doesn't really exist. Still, it is a good weight of meat, and I do expect this list to have games where, yeah, the reinforcement rolls are just nice and consistent, and you have a plan that you more or less follow, and you take good advantage of the fact that the slowest regiment in the list is speed 7. It's really nice and consistently fast. It doesn't have any hugely complicated rules to be concerned about other than making sure that it just executes a good Pheromantic Override turn. And I can definitely see games where Pheromantic Override into Entourage, into the Brutes go in, Incarnate Sentinels break something, hit the lines, and don't collapse, and this list pushes through games. I just don't think it's a list that will be able to do that for 5 games consistently, short of some very good luck. But based on what I've heard, it will at least look great doing it, and I'm really looking forward to seeing these miniatures in person, given, as I said, I understand that won Best Painted at CanCon this year. Next up, we have our one Sorcerer Kings player being played by Penny, and this is an extremely air-centric Sorcerer Kings list, although it makes no use of Jadu Kvatch, which is interesting. We start with a Maharaja who is favoured of Hormus with Eye of the Blazing Tempest. For those who aren't familiar with this combination, favoured of Hormus is you can ride an elephant, and Eye of the Blazing Tempest is whenever you perform an elemental rights action, you heal 3 to all elemental regiments within a certain radius around the wizard. That's going to heal the Mahout itself, it'll heal all of, in this case, the Jinn nearby. It's not a cheap artifact at 30 points, but it is the only way that you can restore stands to Jinn and Efreet regiments, because they typically have 5 wounds. And the trickle healing you get for being born of and targeted by a spell only heals 2. So this is one of the few ways that you can actually restore wounds to things like Steelheart Jinn, which we will see in this list. And of course, it's going to help keep the Mahout going, because he will get those 3 points of heal in that wide radius. It's something like 8 inches from the character stand, and the character stand is very big because it's a Mahout. It's just nice, consistent healing that will pump out and keep things going throughout the list. We've then got a unit of Mahabharati initiates who are born of flame in this particular case. Now this is going to allow some synergy with the Maharaja. He is a Fire Maharaja, although there is one of each. You can only have one of each Court Maharaja. He's going to be able to do things like cast Wreathed in Flames and do a little heal on them. But Mahabharati Initiates are basically just sound medium infantry, reasonably costed, reasonable defenses. Defense 2, Evasion 2 is like right on that. Not sure I'd like this for a model that costs this much, but Resolve 4 helps bridge the gap. And with 5 attacks and movement 6 and a standard bearer and cleave 1 and line breaker and a variety of different synergies, they're basically just much better versions of Sakari, 100 Kingdoms Sakari. They don't have divine purpose, but they do have so much more. However, a regiment being a better version of Sakari for 160 points is not itself weird. There are many regiments that fit into that category. Mahabharati Initiates, again, some light fragilities. They don't like being hit by large volume attacks that bypass that evasion defense stat, or that don't care about that evasion defense stat, but for 160 points, it's a very sound regiment. We've then got, yes, the Mahout. The Mahout is going to be ridden by the Maharaja. Big, tough, kind of, it's not quite a Tontor, but it's also much cheaper. I was way back a little bit of a skeptic of the Maharaja riding the Mahout because you lost the free volley, you lost the archers on the back. I have since come to the conclusion that giving a Maharaja himself and his spellcasting, terror in close combat, there's just a lot of little synergies that make sense. Eye of the Blazing Tempest is one of those. The Mahout is still a very expensive piece. Basically, all heavies in Sorcerer Kings come with a fairly significant opportunity cost because of how Sorcerer Kings play, because a lot of stuff in Sorcerer Kings is expensive. Right now, there's not particularly much room for fat. And so the Mahout is an anchor piece, but it's an expensive anchor piece in a faction that can't always afford. Like the Maharaja in this case is 165, the Mahout is 240. So we are really like building up the points cost, and you begin to start asking yourselves, well, what are we anchoring for? What is benefiting from the fact that the Mahout is a reasonable anchor and brawler piece? In this case, the list answers with Jin, Steelheart, and Windborn, and is planning, presumably, to capitalize on the anchor piece of the Mahout with some fairly high damage, albeit also kind of high fragility, pieces that will play around it. So our second warband, we have a Maharaja, a Warlord. Basically, every Sorcerer Kings list at the moment runs a Maharaja Warlord. This is something we've kind of spoken about in the past, but with the Sorcerer Kings rework, there was a change very shortly after release to how rituals, etc. work. They've been tweaked again since, but basically, if you want to make full access of the ritual mechanic, and it is a good mechanic, and you do want to do that, and it's a reason to play Sorcerer Kings, the only way to do that presently is with the Maharaja. Now, the title of Penny's lists kind of says that Penny is waiting a little bit for an update to Sorcerer Kings, which we do know is coming. And my expectation is that it will be looking to correct that a little bit, but it hasn't arrived yet. In fact, it'll probably drop basically the week after Clash. For now, we have a Maharaja Warlord, Court of Air, and no upgrades. On his merits, the Maharaja Court of Air is excellent. He has one of the best spells in the game. Homing Winds is just absolutely outstanding. Now, in this particular case, the Maharaja will almost certainly be joining the Danho disciples that are in his warband. If we were to jump ahead and read ahead, we would see that there were no other infantry regiments he could join. And so it's not uncommon to see this Maharaja, Court of Air Maharaja, in Danho Disciples with the Neantran artifact, because the Neantran artifact basically says, bro, don't worry about the fact that scaling kicks in at 4, you're going to be fine. In this case, we are just hoping for 3 out of 7 successes to land homing wins on the Danho Disciples, in the knowledge that if we do, the payoff is huge. There's also one other ranged unit that you will sometimes see the Maharaja cast on, a unit of Jin, which is also very good payoff and doesn't have to worry about scaling. We've then got, in addition to the Danho Disciples, 2 units of Steelheart Jin. Now, these guys, they cost. They are expensive. Basically, all of the brute regiments come in at 170 to 180 points, which is about reasonable for what they are. The elemental rule is extremely powerful. I mentioned when we were talking about Chosen of Conquest that there is no rule in the game more powerful in a vacuum than taking an extra action. And in the strictest sense, Steelheart Jin are one of the regiments that makes the best use of that. They are faster, for example, than Efreet Sword Dancers. They've got Cleave 2. When they charge, they're likely to land something like 4 or 5 impact hits, and then 6 or 7 Cleave 2 hits. Sorry, I tell a lie, 8 or 9 Cleave 2 hits, which is, that's a pretty significant output. It's not, however, a particularly durable regiment for 180 points. It's defense 3, resolve 3, 5 wounds. And so it really is relying on the fact that you can heal through little bits of chip damage with some spells maybe, and otherwise it's hoping that the Eye of the Blazing Tempest, Maharaja on Mahut, gets them through any more significant ship damage, and then the threat range proffered by rituals gets them into combat. So you're hoping to make that really long March Charge Clash into close combat from like 17 plus d6, so from 14 plus d6 downtown, which is pretty good, but 14 plus d6 does not out-threat some of the other things that we've seen and will see in this list. Thunder Riders, for example. Thunder Riders will hit Steelheart Djinn from well outside their reliable charge range. That's 19 inches. That would be a 5+ charge for the not unstoppable Steelheart Djinn to make it into melee themselves. And if Thunder Riders hit Steelheart Djinn, they will crumple the regiment. Now, that's a heavy versus medium comparison, but we sort of start to see that although it's a very powerful, the elemental rule is extremely powerful, and this list is trying to generate rituals quickly enough to make that happen, you can only have so many of those, and we've got 4 or 5 elemental units in this list that feel like they need rituals to come above par. Speaking of, we've got a Rakshasa Ravana. The Ravana is the cheaper of the two Rakshasa, probably the worse of the two, but it's 20 points cheaper, so that makes sense. This is the Fiend Hunter. It gets to cleave 3, but it has a relatively low attack volume. But it is speed 6 and dangerous, and benefits very well from Elemental and the various ritual synergies, and is another heavy, but 2 heavies will still mean that your list is always all on the board by speed 4, and Sorcerer Kings are a slower burn anyway. Because Sorcerer Kings need to spin up their rituals, they need to get ready, they prepare in multiple senses. They need to stage their troops, and then they need to have rituals ready, and then they need to have, usually you'll be aiming to have a couple of explosive turns back to back, where you make use of the threat range, you make use of the activations that the rituals represent in your deck, and you move forward at that point when you're ready to explode out from the position that you've prepared yourself. This means that if Sorcerer Kings are penned back, if there are things that out-threaten them significantly, even with the elemental bonus, and if they are facing very, very early game stuff that represents a significant threat to them before they can spin up, they can be in a little bit of danger. Now, if we look at the list that we've seen so far, we are not seeing so far a meta that presents that challenge. The Wadhrun lists, for example, are relatively sensible and moderate, and are not really aggressively pushing the early game. When we jump forward to Old Dominion, we are not going to see full ghost spam lists. We'll see ghosts in every list, but not in such quantities that they might overwhelm Sorcerer Kings as they're coming onto the board. There are, in fact, from memory, there is maybe one list that is running enough lights with long enough threat ranges to prod at these Sorcerer Kings as they're developing. And so I think in practice, barring that one, there's 100 Kingdoms list with quite a lot of lights. Barring that, from the list we've seen so far, I think probably some of the biggest threats that Penny Sorcerer Kings are likely to run into are actually Yoroni. Yoroni, who roll well in reinforcement rolls or who have multiple flanks, can be up and forward and pressing with enough resilience to basically meet the Sorcerer Kings just ahead of the Sorcerer Kings kind of cresting the turn. Now, in that sense, actually, the Ravana is kind of a good choice, because Fiend Hunter is very, very, very good against Yoroni. It works against literally the entire regiment, the entire army. It may as well be Flurry against Yoroni list that we've seen so far. But it is just sort of something kind of to consider. Hey, how do multiple heavies fit into Sorcerer Kings compared to, for example, more mediums? I would be favoring, if I was playing Sorcerer Kings, as many mediums as I could to get characters onto the board early. I would probably not be playing a Mahut. I would be aiming to get all of my characters present on turn 2 if I possibly can, which means lots of medium reinforcement rolls, and then lots of medium regiments, so I can be unpredictable with where my rituals are spent. But that is not an easy style to play, and also it's kind of less cool than Elephants. Elephants are innately cool. Anyway, rounding the list out, we have Warband 3, a Sorcerer, no upgrades, Court of Fire. She's in a unit of Rajikar. Then we have some Born of Flame Mahabharati Initiates and Windborn Djinn. These are the ranged Windborn Djinn. This is the most expensive Elemental Brute regiment, 190 points for a medium, but good range and armor piercing. This is probably the natural choice for casting Homing Winds from the Maharaja. He won't be affected by scaling because there's only 3 of them, and with only Volley 2, they really significantly benefit from the rerolls. And I have found that while this is a very good regiment for exerting pressure, it's very rare for it to really generate 190 points worth of value. 13 shots with rerolls will genuinely do damage and will add up over time. 190 points is hugely expensive. Now, kind of as noted, probably the most significant thing that is worth mentioning here, apart from, hey, this is one of two ways that you can play Sorcerer Kings, and the other one is to go as many activations and brutes as you can, is, yeah, there is a notable absence, which is the Jadu Kvatch artifact. Jadu Kvatch is very, very common in Sorcerer Kings. And it's kind of a build around artifact where you put it on a character, you trigger a spell, and you get Born of X, whatever the spellcaster's type is, Fire Sorcerer, Air Sorcerer, etc. They get reroll 6s on all attack rolls. It's a very powerful effect, but it does kind of constrain you. For example, Mahut do not have a Born of rule. You are forced to try and not mix your regiments. You're forced to try and go all court of one, or court of the other, or court of fire, etc. So the Maharabati initiates, well, we've seen a Fire Maharaja and Air Maharaja. The Air Maharaja will basically always just be casting on the Danhura Disciples or on the Windborn Jinn. The Fire Sorcerer is a bit more flexible. This list doesn't really have to make any choices because it's not committing to Jadu Kvatch, and therefore it's got fewer failure states. And anyone who has played against a Jadu Kvatch list absolutely has run into those turns where their opponent has just been like, I failed the spell. I don't trigger Jadu Kvatch this turn. The thing my list is built around didn't work. Now, for 30 points, it's very reasonable that that happen from time to time, but when you 30 points and build around, and maybe you introduce some weaknesses or some limitations to your list, it's difficult to have Jadu Kvatch simultaneously reach its maximum potential and not betray you hugely some of the time. So I don't blame Penny for not including it. Also don't blame Penny for including Mahut and Rakshasa, because they're cool as hell. But I do kind of expect this list to have what we can really only call just a materiel disadvantage against some lists. If you play this into a list that is just quick and efficient and kind of brutally constructed, stuff like Yoroni, for example, or even potentially there is at least one city-states and possibly a Dweghom list that I know is coming up that can absolutely hit you before you finish developing, I think it just potentially represents a challenge for this list. And so in that vein, Penny, I wish you all of the best. Has the update dropped yet? No, it hasn't, mate. Really sorry, you're going to have to wait another week after Clash. Now, up next, we get into Old Dominion, and Old Dominion are one of our most popular factions at Clash at the Coast, with 4 Old Dominion players. There's an interesting list of mix of lists here. Quite a lot of variety in how each list is constructed, and I would also note like a fair bit of self-expression here. There has been something of a meta list that has developed stateside in the United States that makes very extensive use of Old Dominion light regiments, and it's very powerful. I've personally played with and against certain lists, and it's the kind of list that responds very effectively to the US style early game focused metagame. It competes in and wins that arms race against certain oppositions, and is generally just strong, aggressive, and powerful. In all 4 of the lists that we're going to see today for Old Dominion, we will see ghosts present. We will see Karez and possibly Moroi, but certainly Karez in every list, which is perfectly reasonable because Karez are exceptional, but they'll generally be part of a more moderate force mix. We're going to see more mediums, more heavies. There's going to be at least one old Fallen Divinity present. And so the general description I would give of our Clash at the Coast Old Dominion list is more personalized. And we're going to start with Cody's Old Dominion list called Possible Coast Clash. Well, you've picked it, Cody, so here we go. This is a Strategos Warlord list. Strategos is probably a personal favorite of mine in terms of Warlords for the Old Dominion alongside, well, actually, all of them are quite good. Strategos is one of the easiest to use and yet allows a great deal of creativity. Once per game, your whole army, 1, counts as a high level of dark power, but 2, more importantly, gets free reforms, is an extremely powerful and extremely flexible rule. Now, the Strategos in this case has Skofnung, and he is almost certainly going to be joining that MSU of Athanati. Athanati picked up a big buff in the last Old Dominion update. They're a very nice regiment. They put out a huge volume of attacks, which they land very accurately thanks to Flurry, which means they score many, many hits, which means that Skofnung is a great addition because it gives them Line Breaker. Now, for my money, I'm a little bit cautious about the addition of a 115-point Strategos Warlord to a 170-point Defense 2 regiment, even with Tenacious. Those Athanatoi will not last forever against Sustained Fire, but with 4 stands in the unit and speed 6 and a banner, they have good personal threat range, and there are a lot of other things in the list that can kind of screen for. They are not being asked to take a huge load of work from the list. I think it would have been really nice to get even just one more Athanity into that regiment, just so it's got 5 stands, just so that its breakpoint is a little bit earlier. It breaks at 3 stands rather than 2. Just so it's got 16 rather than 12 wounds, but those points would have to come from somewhere, and the list is otherwise running pretty tight. We've then got a unit of Legionnaires and 2 units of Cataphracts with Standard Bearers. Now, the 2 Cataphracts as opposed to 1 I actually quite like. Oh, sorry, one of them doesn't have a Standard Bearer. Anyway, 2 units of Cataphracts. Now, it would be nice for these to be larger regiments, for example, a Mounted Strategos in one of them. But there is a particular synergy that you get when you have 2 of this regiment rather than 1, and any kind of shock cavalry. And that basically is that it helps you counter one of what would otherwise be one of the problems that Cataphractoi face. Cataphractoi in particular, if you're at tier 2 but not at tier 3, which is often going to be the case for a fair bit of the game, Cataphractoi are very good if they get to charge and clash, or at least charge, but really you want to charge and clash with them. If you get much charged into, the offensive output of a unit of Cataphractoi is relatively anemic. It's going to be 16 attacks on Clash 2 with no ability to inspire at that point in the game. Now, one of the ways that you solve this is you just pair up your Cataphractoi units, because if your opponent march charges into one of them, and then you draw a Cataphractoi card, no problem, you just flank charge and clean up whatever engaged the first unit of Cataphractoi, which enables that first unit later in the turn to move forward and do whatever it is that you need, because you draw a Cataphractoi card, and whichever one has been engaged is going to get bailed out by the other. You get this effect from 2 of them that you wouldn't get with 1. Now, the concession that we are making is that they are expensive and you aren't able to move them up to 4 stands, which means that the threat extension they get from the Strategos' free reform on his supremacy turn is a little more limited. You get significantly more extra threat out of a 4 or 5 wide regiment than you do out of a 3 wide when you make that free reform to close the gap between yourself and an opponent. But I do like 2 Cataphractoi working together, and my expectation is that they would probably arrive later if you need them to, but arrive together. We then have an Archimandrite, no upgrades on the Archimandrite, and he's in a relatively straightforward warband of 4 Legionnaires, which is what he will be joining, with a Standard Bearer but no other upgrades, 3 Karez, and 3 Bone Golems. These are all good quality units, and the 4 Legionnaires adds a little bit of durability to the priest in case he gets jumped. Now, this is a point where, for my money, I was mentioning, hey, I would personally love an extra Athanity stand. I think I would prefer a 4th Athanity stand to a 4th Legionnaire stand. Just the Archimandrite in the Legionnaires should just be in the rear with the gear. He does not have to be forward. He does not have to be frontline. That regiment can take 13 wounds with no change to its effectiveness, because as long as he's alive, he's doing things. Whereas the extra wounds on the Athanity, Tenacious Regiment, carrying your Warlord, going to be in combat, goes a little bit further. But I am respectful of the fact that it would be X number of dollars to buy an entire extra Athanity box in order to get that 4th Athanity stand, whereas most Old Dominion players have an ample supply of Legionnaires on hand. Bone Golems are good, Karez are good, these are otherwise just good regiments. We've then got a Hero Deacon, again, no upgrades, no need for any upgrades on a Hero Deacon, 3 Legionnaires, 3 Centaur Kirkis, and a unit of Canaphors. Now, that rounds us in at the highest activation count in any list that we have seen so far. This is a 13 activation list, which is on the high side. 11 or 12 tends to be the average. We've seen Yoroni on both sides of that, for example. And that higher activation count is also beneficial to helping getting the most out of the Cataphractoi. Now, the list does thin its early game out a little bit to accommodate all of these mediums, etc. There's just 1 light unit of Karez, moving on, kind of in a screening role. Frankly, they're going to be well served. In many games, you would actually have them just hang back. There is no need for them to be present early. Despite the fact that they're a light, they tend to transition well into the late game. And so it would actually be quite easy, for example, to imagine this list playing a little bit like the Yoroni, building up and then surging forward, kind of more like on turn 3. The list only has 2 heavies, which means it can reliably be present 100% on the board by turn 4. And despite the fact that it is 13 activations, it's only 3 characters, which means it has 10 regiments, which means it has a deep and therefore slightly more consistent reserve dice pool. And most importantly, it's got ample units that you're comfortable arriving a bit later if you need to. It is no problem at all if the Cataphractoi don't arrive, for example, until turn 3. It's no problem at all if one of the little MSU Legionnaire units, they're like, for example, the unit in the Strategos' warband, that doesn't arrive until turn 4, and all it does is just walk towards an objective and say, if you don't contest this, we will score it. That's also fine. There's enough activations, there's enough units in the list otherwise, that the list can kind of afford to accommodate one or two, like, failed reserve rolls here and there. The list is also not banking on the arrival of heavies. One of the two heavy regiments will probably auto on turn 3, and if the other one doesn't arrive until turn 4, Cannifors are a great emergency response regiment. Bone Golems don't particularly mind being able to pick their targets. And so, unlike some other lists that are maybe a little bit more contingent on doing things like passing heavy reserve rolls in order to have things happen at the right time, this list I think will probably just have however the reserve curve happens to roll out, whether you have good luck or bad luck, it will have a reasonable ability to capitalize on that, and that's pretty nice. It's also got good dark power acceleration. The Archimandrite and the Hero Deacon I would expect to both arrive on turn 2 and then start the process of generating dark power every turn. Everyone will have seen that at this point, but if you haven't, if you're new to Conquest, the Hero Deacon, in addition to generating power every turn herself, gets to kill a stand of your troops, which the Archimandrite brings back with healing. And it's like an almost certain success in both cases because of things like Devout, etc. And so this list has a nice mix of not early game, not exactly, but good solid medium game pressure, ability to surge forward over the course of turn 3 and turn 4, build a good battle line, execute on a plan, and then play the Old Dominion game, which is that it's very durable because it's Old Dominion and it transitions well into the late game regardless of its heavy presence because of the Dark Power mechanic. This list can reach Dark Power tier 4, it has payoff for reaching Dark Power tier 4 in the form of the Archimandrite and Hero Deacon spells, and so is, overall, just a nice, consistent Old Dominion list. The double Cataphractoi, again, is a little bit of a flex. That's a personalization in the list, but it's cool to see, and I expect the list to perform fairly well. Our next Old Dominion list belongs to Jonathan, and he's done me a terrible disservice by putting the Warlord right at the very bottom. This is a Heliarch Warlord list. We're starting, however, with a bunch of priests. We've got an Archimandrite with the Consecrated Mitre, unit of Karez, and a Praetorian Guard. The Consecrated Mitre is the 25-point artifact that lets the Archimandrite's Priest skill increase as Dark Power increases. So he's going to be Priest 8 at the gate because Dark Power Tier 1 will give him +1 Priest, and he can reach in this list, if he gets enough Dark Power, Priest 11, which is a fairly significant blasting character in combination with the Unholy Baptism spell, which has decent range, decent attunement, armor piercing 1, causes resolve checks, and if he gets into melee, the fact that he and his regiment have terror will make the resolve checks against Unholy Baptism even scarier. Now, 3 Karez, as mentioned, is just a good solid light regiment. The Praetorian Guard are where the Archimandrite will be going. Now, I am not sure I personally rate the Profane Reliquary upgrade to Praetorian Guard, but with an Archimandrite in them, they're going to have access to healing, potentially quite a lot of healing. Late in the game, the Archimandrite can restore an entire stand of Praetorians with every spellcasting action, which is very significant. 5 wounds back as an action, if you don't go for the offensive spell, for example, could be very strong. And because this regiment is really soundly durable and has offensive potential thanks to the Unholy Baptism with potentially Priest 10 or 11, having just a little bit of extra grind power if you've got the 25 points for the Profane Reliquary is fine. I'm a big fan of Archimandrites in Praetorian Guards as a well-rounded kind of regiment, but my experience with them is kind of before some changes to the Old Dominion, and especially before changes to Aura of Death, which in my opinion made the Profane Reliquary and actually most of the Aura of Death upgrades in the Old Dominion kinda okay at best outside of things like Bone Golem MSUs. We then have a second Archimandrite. This one's got 2 upgrades. It's got the Sanctified Labaron and the Shemaphore upgrade. Now, Semaphore, Schemaphore, however that is pronounced, turns the Archimandrite into a Hero Deacon. It gives you the Dark Shepherd draw event, which is the kill a stand, just murder your own troops so that they generate dark power so that you can restore them with healing. And if you don't have a Hero Deacon in a list, this is a way of getting a little bit of extra dark power quickly without having to worry about the fact that you need to pay 90 points otherwise for a Hero Deacon to access the draw event, etc. Sanctified Labaron is a rare pick in Old Dominion and lets you count one of your restricted troops as mainstay. And when we jump into the Archimandrite's warband, you'll see what's been done with that. And so what we have here is an MSU of Legionnaires, which the Archimandrite will be joining, and then 3 restricted troops, Moroi, Bone Golems, and Bone Golems. Now, this is not an artifact that I would personally take particularly often. Sanctified Labaron is 40 points, and I like Moroi, and I like Bone Golems, but I wouldn't personally play pay 220 points for Mainstay Moroi. I wouldn't pay 250 points for Mainstay Bone Golem. Being Mainstay is nice, but it's a huge premium to pay that takes a material chunk out of your list. Still, in this case, that extra restricted slot has accommodated Moroi Bone Golems, which otherwise just wouldn't be accessible. Now, whether that 3 stand of Moroi is better than almost 5 stands of Karez is kind of an open question, but they are very good and they're a cool unit to play with, and so we can kind of see that having been made use of here. We've then got the final warband. This is a Heliarch Warlord warband. And so once per game, the Heliarch's warband only will get a free clash action. It's free additional, which means that you can charge clash or clash charge clash, which means it's the highest sort of watermark damage output. It's the only way, or one of the only ways in the game, to get 2 clashes in an activation. Almost every other free action of any sort gates you in some capacity behind more than, it stops you from having more than 1 attack per activation, and this is a rare exception to that. However, the Heliarch's regiment is not really making full use of that. The Heliarch himself is relatively cheaply kitted out. He's relying on just his native good attack values with Aventine Armor for Tenacious, and then he's just got 2 MSUs of Legionnaires. Legionnaires are anemic on the offense at the best of times. It is not their purpose, and so all of the power of that supremacy is being channeled through the Heliarch in an MSU of Varangian Guard. I like Varangian Guards a lot, and if they get to charge clash or march charge clash, they will do damage, but that is a very low return on a supremacy. I think it's probably objectively a mistake to have, for example, 2 regiments of Bone Golems when there is a free slot in this warband that could just have 3 more Varangian Guards. They cost the same. A Varangian Guard unit with a Standard Bearer is identical in cost to a Bone Golem, and the Heliarch's supremacy without multiple regiments that are threatening to play off of it is just not doing terribly much. And so basically the entire supremacy boils down to, once a game, 1 unit gets some benefit. You may as well at least get a 2nd unit of Varangian Guard in there. My personal preferred loadout, if I'm running a Heliarch Warlord, is to have things like Centaurs, maybe the Heliarch himself with Calamitas and something like a unit of Praetorians. Those are mainstay, and then they unlock your Varangians. Varangians don't need a Heliarch's help to be dangerous, and they benefit very well from his feat. So something like, if you're going whole hog with a Heliarch Warlord, Centaur Prodromoi, Praetorians that the Heliarch himself joins with a good sword, Varangians, that's kind of your gold standard make benefit of the Heliarch's supremacy ability. That is absent here, and so for practical purposes, this list almost doesn't really have a supremacy ability or a meaningful warlord. Now, that's a significant downside, but the list otherwise it's got powerful heavies, decent mid-game. I really like the Praetorians with the Archimandrite, and I cannot underestimate the potential for grind you get out of a list with 2 Archimandrites. Because of the Heliarch Warlord, this list can reach Tier 4 Dark Power, and at Tier 4 Dark Power, Archimandrites casting Hazlia's Touch restore 5 wounds per cast of Hazlia's Touch. That's enough to reliably return Praetorian and Varangian Guard, and even Bone Golem in many cases stands to play. And while there are absolutely lists out there that can heal more than 10 wounds a turn under the right circumstances, those are not lists that have the durability of Old Dominion. The power of healing is directly commensurate to how difficult it was to inflict those wounds in the first place, and it is much, much easier to inflict, for example, 10 wounds on an Spires list that has lots of regeneration than it is to inflict 10 wounds on Bastioning Praetorian Guards, hardened Bone Golems, hardened Varangians, etc. And so, even though 10 or 8 wounds a turn in absolute terms is less than some lists can restore each turn, although it's much, much more than others, the innate durability of Old Dominion make that healing really, really scary. And so that's kind of my expectation for where this list will get its wins. It won't get its wins off of big Heliarch supremacy turn plays. It will get its wins off the fact that it grinds and grinds and grinds and restores plan stands to play and generates dark power. And at the end of the game, the carry is not the Heliarch, the carry are 2 Archimandrites healing high value regiments. If you're playing against this list, An absolute priority is going to be allocating force in ways that breaks and shatters regiments, or if you can, getting a pick in particular on the 185-point Archimandrite. He's just in a unit of Legionnaires, he might be able to get picked off early, and if you can, it will cut off, firstly, the source of dark power that the list is generating, because he is one of the main sources of dark power with Shima-4, but also it will halve the healing that the list is going to be taking, inflicting on you every turn after turn. And if you can just limit how much healing the list generates, the attrition becomes difficult but more manageable. Now, up next, our third Old Dominion list and second Heliarch Warlord list, we have Jeff's Old Dominion. Now, Jeff's a cheeky sod. He's been playing a bunch of Nords at events recently. I've had the pleasure of playing him in at least one recent event. In fact, I've played Jeff a number of times over the course of various different events, and consistently one of the most enjoyable opponents and skilled opponents I've had the pleasure of playing against. And I had no idea he owned Old Dominion. In fact, I would doubt this was Jeff if it wasn't for the fact that the list bears his idiom, which is not just an interesting list name, but also uniquely named individual warbands. That's how I know this is indeed Jeff. Jeff, it's cool to see you playing Old Dominion. So we start with a Heliarch, with what I personally consider to be the gold standard for Heliarch equipment, which is Aventine Armor for Tenacious, Calamitas for 7 attacks with Cleave 2. Calamitas is just a dream on the Heliarch. The fact that it stacks with him in full and takes him to 7 attacks, Clash 3 with Flurry and Cleave 2 is just incredible. It's an all-time gold standard loadout and is just really, really strong. Here we can see some of what I was talking about with my previous discussion of Heliarch Warlord regiments, where we have a full 4 regiments, and they are designed to do at least some damage with, well, okay, there are 2 Legionnaire regiments, but we have Centaur Prodromoi at least, and Centaur Prodromoi make good use of the Heliarch Supremacy ability. Now, they aren't exactly impact cavalry, but they are serviceable combatants for cheap, and with March 8, they make good use either of a March Charge Clash for really quite significant threat ranges, or, under ideal circumstances, a Charge Clash. If you have things go right, you can set that up at the end of turn, execute at the beginning, do a whole bunch of damage. And really, if there was one thing I'd love to see, it's for both of these other Legionnaire regiments, if they could, to be things like Centaur Prodromoi. Still, okay, we have 2 units of Legionnaires. As discussed, these make somewhat anemic use of the Old Dominion supremacy, but we at least then have a 4th regiment, so these are full 4 regiments that can benefit, and we see the Heliarch himself most likely to be placed in that big unit of Athanati. Now, this is actually a slightly weird pick. I think there's a possibility that the Heliarch might end up in a unit of Legionnaires, which turns them into a very dangerous unit of Legionnaires indeed, but still somewhat fragile even with Aventine armor. The reason why I think that might actually be a possibility is that I'm not sure why Jeff would take Aventine armor if he's putting the Heliarch in Athanati. Athanati already have Tenacious 1, Aventine armor does not stack with that. And so I think the 2 possible outcomes here are either 1, the Heliarch goes in Legionnaires and makes the world's most dangerous Legionnaire MSU, or 2, Jeff has been playing a bunch of Nords recently, and in Nords, their 25-point Tenacious item does stack with Tenacious on Nords natively, so he may actually just have missed that and effectively be paying 20 points down. Now, if that's the case, a little bit of a shame, the list will still perform fine. But Jeff, if you do listen to this, let me know which one of those is the case. Now, moving on from the Heliarch, we have the second, martial combat group. We have a Mounted Strategos with Eleuthera, Giver of Mercy. This is just a 10-point sword. It does a bunch of stuff with duels, which is not super relevant. It does turn the Mounted Strategos into a very capable duelist, but more importantly, it gives him +1 clash. And since he is an impact cavalryman, +1 clash goes a long way. He is then in a large unit of Cataphractoi, and here we see the rare Hetarios sighting. Hetarios is an officer that at some expense can be added to a Cataphract regiment, and it gives them the Overrun special rule. Overrun does 2 things. The first thing is if a regiment is broken after you complete your impact attacks, you can do your impact attacks again, which usually kills the regiment that is broken. And the second thing it lets you do is declare 2 charges in a round. So those abilities can trigger, you can have charge into a regiment, break them, trigger Overrun for the additional clash attacks, shatter the regiment, charge, break them, trigger overrun for the additional impact attacks, shatter the regiment. And so the dream of this regiment with 5 cavalry stands is that it does that kind of dream play, where it charges, kills, and charges again, or, at absolute worst, march charges, but with so many impacts, triggers the overrun for the break and then the shatter, getting the double up of overrun attacks. And I think in practice, because this isn't a Strategos Warlord list, that's going to probably be the more common play. But if you describe this regiment as, oh yeah, hey, they have 6 impacts each, that's pretty good. The precursor to that, of course, the prerequisite is that you do break your opponent as part of the first set of impact attacks. But the list inflicts an average of 8 brutal impact 2, terror 1 impact attacks per charge if it's got Memories of Old up, and it should if it's charging. And that's pretty much a sure thing to break almost any MSU, and even actually be threatening to some larger regiments. Next up, we have an Archimandrite, as before with the Schema 4 upgrade. This list is already running a little expensive with the Heliarch's Warband and the Matter Strategos and the Cataphract, so we save ourselves just a little bit of points by having the Archimandrite play the role of both Archimandrite and Hero Deacon. And then he is bringing along a little MSU of Legionnaires, which he will join, 3 Karez, 3 Bone Golems, and 3 Bone Golems. Now that puts us in total at a fairly healthy 12 activations, nice median number, and a good selection of units that are really quite scary to have, activate, charge, clash, etc. As with the previous Old Dominion list, we've hit that just 2 heavies, which means the entire army will reliably be present by turn 4, and kind of the same as with the other list, we have enough mediums of different types and just the 1 light regiment, which means we have a very smoothable reinforcement curve. If some Legionnaires arrive late, well, you know what, they were going to be in the Heliarchs. It'll probably be the Heliarch's Warband Legionnaires that arrive the latest, but if one of those doesn't get the benefit from his supremacy, that's not the end of the world. And so the list can stagger its arrivals and manage things fairly well. In comparison to the previous Hero Deacon Heliarch list as well, we also have more early punch potential, even though it has fewer overall regiments. Because the 2 main regiments that you are using the Heliarch Supremacy on are Speed 8 Medium Prodromoy and Speed 6 with a Standard Bearer Medium Athanati, and neither of those regiments is particularly contingent on Dark Power. If the Central Prodromoy don't have Dark Power, whoop-de-doo, it's 2 impact hits with Brutal 1 that they haven't landed on the enemy. You can, if you need to, really shift into a faster gear with this list, and as your first 2 mediums bring on the Heliarch and the Centaurs, Athanatoy and Prodromoy move forward. Again, I am assuming that the Heliarch having Aventine armor here is just a little bit of a reading error. And then pull the trigger on the Supremacy early to make contact with the Prodromoy on the Athanati and potentially get significant picks on your opponent. If you can surge forward early in the game, something that Old Dominion outside of Ghost list doesn't normally do, get a significant kill or even 2, you can start an attritional train rolling that can be very difficult to recover from. So this is an interesting and flexible list. It definitely plays to what I've kind of observed to be Jeff's style, which is that ability to shift gears over the course of the game, play different speeds as needed. It's something I've observed him being quite good at in his list construction generally. And so this definitely qualifies yet again as another interesting list to watch over the course of Clash. Now, our final Old Dominion list is actually one I suspect that we've covered on the channel in the past. This is David F's list. David is a long-time Fallen Divinity player. In fact, I wouldn't really describe David necessarily as an Old Dominion player. He is a Fallen Divinity player, and this is just the Fallen Divinity list that he took to CanCon. David's had an awful lot on recently, a lot of good things, I think, happening in his life. There's a wedding potentially that is happening, and so he's not really been like, yeah, I'm not writing a whole new list. This worked before, it was fine, it's good, and we'll play it again. And so, what we have is a Fallen Divinity with Aura of Malice, but not Eternal Discipline. That makes her somewhat vulnerable to ranged attacks, but my experience with the Divinity is that is manageable. Very few tables don't have at least some obscuring terrain on them, and if a Fallen Divinity has access to obscuring terrain and healing, which she has in this list, and just keeps her distance until she's ready to push forward, upgrades like, for example, Eternal Discipline, which has just recently been reconfirmed to work on the Divinity. I believe we saw an FAQ or ruling that she was actually okay to use that again, despite some changes to wording around regiments in her rule. I have not personally found that to be necessary. In fact, my personal experience with the Fallen Divinity, which includes event wins with her, has been that the best thing to do with her is to run her as cheap as possible and have a list that otherwise acts entirely independently, which does 2 things. The first thing, it means that if she dies and all of her power flows into the secondary dark power pool, you just play the Old Dominion game and it's fine, but beyond that, it turns her into more of a win con without being necessarily a mechanical carry. It stops being obligatory that she be the one to win the game, and instead the rest of your list, if she's just 300 points, the rest of your list becomes powerful enough that it can potentially win the game by itself, and if it doesn't, well then she's there. I just like having that mix of strengths. That, however, is a personal opinion. And David has played this list many times, and he is familiar with it, and it's a good choice for him. So we have the Fallen Divinity with Aura of Malice. She's got a unit of Canophores in her warband. We then have Hero Deacon in Legionnaires, Archimandrite in Legionnaires. No upgrades on any of this, but no need to. The Archimandrite will most of the time be healing back regiments stands that the Hero Deacon kills with Dark Shepherd, but do not underestimate the possibility, and in fact the psychic damage that you deal directly to your opponent if you use Hazlia's Touch on a Fallen Divinity. She's a perfectly legal target for it, and although it only heals 2 wounds because this is not a list that generates normal dark power, even 2 wounds back on a Fallen Divinity can be enough to keep her alive, just long enough for her to transition up into the higher Dark Power tier. So bear that in mind if you're playing against this list. Watch out for the fact that the Archimandrite might be able to heal the Fallen Divinity, which keeps her alive long enough for the regular Dark Power accumulation to result in a surge of healing. That's something that David, I've played against him several times. He's very, very good at managing that accumulation of Dark Power. I have never found it possible to sneak damage in at a point where he can't potentially heal it. What that means is that an all-in commit on the Fallen Divinity to kill her, I mean, it's almost always a bad idea, but it's a particularly bad idea against a player of David's caliber because he knows really well how to manage that Dark Power accumulation. Now, otherwise, in the Archimandrite's Warband, we have a unit of 4 Karez, slightly upskilled in terms of this is a unit that is scarier with its insanities and its spellcasting. I've actually found that since the most recent update with the change to a free, or second most recent update in this case, the change to a free spellcasting action, Karez actually don't need Dark Power that much because they're kind of fine. Like, if they get to tier 3, that's ideal, but they're actually kind of fine moving and then using an action to generate additional, to just trigger their memories, and then casting an 8 dice insanity. That is still a 20-inch threat on a quite scary ranged attack with a unit that is very resistant to counter battery fire. So no concerns at all personally about using Karez in a list that doesn't generate dark power. They're fine. 4 Bone Golems is our next regiment. Again, 4 Bone Golems. Technically there are slightly diminishing returns because of the fact that the Aura of Death is a static number on these guys, but Bone Golems are good, and trying to punch through 4 of them is very challenging. Finally, we have a Heliarch with a unit of Legionnaires with a Dark Cenotaph. This is a unit that will actually try and arrive somewhat early and jump onto a safe zone and sit there all game. It accelerates the Dark Power generation in the list. And this may have been a change that David made just before CanCon. In some previous versions of this list that he has run, he's had the Dark Cenotaph be on one of the Legionnaire units that one of the priests is in. And in my experience, that put that unit in too much danger because there are some scenarios where you really have to move this unit forward to have the Dark Cenotaph trigger. Maelstrom, for example, has zones on the halfway line, and neither of those priests has any business being on the halfway line. So I really like this little change of moving these Legionnaires, the Dark Cenotaph, just to be their own regiment that just moves forward and jumps on a zone and sits there and scores. And if they die, okay, you're down 120 points, but you aren't down a character, part of the Dark Power engine, etc. I think this is a really good change. The Heliarch himself has Aventine Armor and Legio Primigenia and Eternal Discipline, and here's in a unit of 4 Varangian Guard. So this is a very, very durable Varangian Guard regiment. I've run something like this myself previously. Legio Primigenia means that they count as Dark Power Tier 2. So they get memories as a draw event. Aventine Armor gives them Tenacious. Eternal Discipline lets them reroll 6s. It's untouchable. And so you have a Varangian Guard regiment that is Defense 3, Hardened 1, Untouchable, Tenacious. It is a real brick. I have experimented with this regiment in previous versions of the game, moving them all the way up. I think at the largest size I ran this regiment, I ran this exact regiment, but with 7 stands of Varangian. And the sheer durability was actually almost impossible to overcome by basically any army that I was playing against at the time. 4 stands of Varangian Guards is obviously only 20 wounds, but it's 20 wounds with all of those defensive buffs, no resolve damage. It's a linebacker of a unit that will push forward and deal damage, and really most things in the game don't particularly want to fight that regiment. Nothing deals damage to them efficiently. There is nothing that's like, oh yeah, no worries, bruv, we've got this, we can push through that. No, nothing pushes through that efficiently. It's actually most of the time better to just hold that regiment up, kill the things around them, and try and just lock them to a zone somewhere. You can, through overwhelming applications of firepower, slowly wear them down, but it takes too long and it's too much effort, particularly in a list that also has the Fallen Divinity. In effect, what you're getting out of that Heliarch's regiment is a second Avengers level threat in the list, and it can be quite difficult for any given list to respond to both of those threats at the same time. Now, they do arrive a little bit later. The Heliarch and his regiment are heavy, the Fallen Divinity arrives as a light, but she takes time to power up. This list really maximizes the dark power generation. She is going to, particularly if the Legionnaires with the Cenotaph, get onto a zone and sit there for a couple of turns. She will hit dark power tier 3 very, very fast, at which point the rampage will begin. And kind of ironically, if you put pressure on all of those regiments that are generating that dark power, you will kill stands, which will cause dark power to be generated, which will in turn accelerate the Fallen Divinity. So usually this list is going to be aggressively online by about halfway through the game, and so the play against it at that point is if you can just put enough force in one place to win the game on just kind of half of the table, hope to kill things elsewhere, be up on scenario, because one of the things you can do, even though she is an early scoring regiment, you can sometimes zone her out a little bit because she is vulnerable before tier 3. But beyond that, your best chance against this list is basically going to be which of the two significant heavy threats, the Heliarch, I mean, the Bone Golems are also very scary, and the Cannophores are scary, but which of the most dangerous threats in the list can you actually potentially focus down and destroy, and which do you just have to accept that you don't have the force available to deal with them, they are going to rampage, and to limit the effects of their rampage for as long as possible. Fall back against the strongest points, press in where the list is moderately weaker, and try and limit the Old Dominion's application of that late game strength to just a part of the table. Up next, we have Nords. We have 3 Nord players at Clash this year, and here we're going to see a mix of what I can only describe as meme and non-meme list constructions. The first Nord player we have is Alan. Alan wins a small prize for second most cursed list points in the entire event with 1,980 of 2,000 points spent, leaving 1% of his army just on the table. And this is a Blooded Warlord list. Now, the Blooded Supremacy allows you to select one additional half-blood regiment every round. So trolls, for example, are half-bloods to arrive on the field in addition to your usual one automatic pick. And I will be honest, that's a little bit of an odd choice to me in this case, because as far as I can tell, there is exactly one unit of half-bloods in this entire list, which kind of means that the entire supremacy boils down to flank on the trolls. But let's see if we can find some method in the madness. So the Blooded is the Warlord. He's carrying Yoda, the Redbringer, which is going to do two and a half things. It's going to give those trolls that he is part of impact +2 special rules, so they'll be making some impact attacks only at Clash 2, but there are 4 stands of them. And it's going to give him +2 attacks characteristic, which on attacks 4 going up to attack 7, so Clash 4, attacks from 5 up to 7, cleave 2, very high return on picking Yoda for the Blooded. And then finally, it means he can always die fighting regardless of whether he has activated that turn or not, which is actually really solid on a model that is that dangerous. Now, you never want your Warlord to die, and you're kind of hoping that those trolls will survive. But when that ability does trigger, it's a really big deal. Now, the Blooded is in 4 trolls, and as I mentioned, as far as I can tell, this is the only half-blood regiment in the list, so it's the only thing that benefits from his supremacy. Now, up next, we have the model that should probably, in my opinion, have been the Warlord. We have a Volya, and she has Coils of the Serpent and Ancestor's Blessing. Coils of the Serpent is going to give the regiment that she joins, which will almost certainly be a unit of Valkyries, could be a unit of Raiders actually in this case. Had she been the Warlord, it should have been a unit of Valkyries. And Ancestor's Blessing, which grants Bastion, which is why I'm almost certain that she's going to go in the Valkyries. So she'll be in the Valkyries. She makes them Evasion 1, and Defense 2 with a Shield and Blessed and Bastion, which is nice and durable, admittedly on a fairly small regiment. Now, Coils of the Serpent, why do I think she should have been the Warlord? Coils of the Serpent stacks quite nicely with her Warlord ability, gets models up to Evasion 2, so those Valkyries go to Defense 2, Evasion 2, which against High Cleave really lets them power on. Going from Defense 2, Evasion 1 to Defense 2, Evasion 2 is also a really big deal for the Trolls. It's a really big deal for all Raiders. In fact, basically, The Volya, or the Shaman, if that's what you've got instead, should probably be the Warlord of every single Nords list. It is just the most powerful supremacy by a wide margin. So the decision to have the Blooded be the Warlord here, particularly when there is so little payoff. Like, I have seen lists with ample, like a large number of Half-Bloods that use the Blooded just as like, you know what, this is just smoothing out the reinforcement curve, this is multiple units get flank, I'm going to make use of this. I've seen, for example, I played against a list at a recent event that ran Stalkers and Trolls and multiple units of Golter, which meant that on any given turn, you had control over when the Stalkers arrived, and then you get 2 autos on, one of which would be the Trolls on turn 2. And then, because you would invariably fail some medium reinforcement rolls, the Golter would start being autoed on turn 3. So the list was always 100% on the table entirely on turn 3, which is a really nice luxury. That's a good use of the Blooded Supremacy. This list is probably not, but the list would benefit hugely from the Volya being the Warlord. Anyway, she's got Valkyries, Raiders with Captain, Raiders with Captain. Raiders with Captain is just an excellent choice. 140 points isn't cheap, but the unit does have nice damage output. And it does the thing that one of the things that Nords have become very well known for doing, which is having good access to light scoring. Light scoring is not the be-all and end-all of the game, but having it is better than not having it, and it can put your opponent in a position where they now have the obligation to change the status quo. If you score earlier than they do, now you don't have to be the one that moves forward and takes space and does zones and exposes yourself to risk, because if nothing else changes, you'll win the game, because the score is in your favor. Now, my experience is that that is something that is just more of a mental problem than an actual in-play one, because this is a 10-turn game. But scoring pressure does still exert pressure on your opponent, and Raiders are early scoring regiments and also perfectly dangerous in their own right. 4 attacks, but with flurry and with impact attacks and with tenacious, etc. is really good. What would be better is if they were evasion too. We've then got a Coninger. He's picked up the massive frame upgrade for +2 impact attacks and line breaker, and Wealth of 100 Raids, which is a somewhat pricey but nice upgrade that gives Dauntless to the regiment that he's in. He will be joining those Steel Chosen, and here we go, Defense 2, Evasion 1. Wouldn't it be great if that was an Evasion 2 regiment? I'm kind of beating this drum a little bit, and I will stop at this point, but that is kind of something to note. Steel Chosen, yet another regiment, really nice offensive damage output, lots of attacks and flurry and line breaker. But even with 5 wounds, they're not that durable, and armor piercing or cleave 1 attacks tend to do a number on them. Going to evasion 2 would be a really nice change that mitigates that, but not something that's available in this list. We then have a unit of Bow Chosen. The presence of the Bow Chosen means that the Conigers' treble tactics will probably be opportunist. They benefit a lot from that. But overall, I kind of have to question this warband. There's no individual unit in it I think is particularly bad. I think the Chosen regiments are a bit expensive, and they don't work as nicely with the Conigers' tribal tactics as the War Brethren rule kind of says that they should. But this is a list that has Blooded as the Warlord, and it just isn't making good use of his supremacy ability. If the Blooded is going to be the Warlord, then this warband should probably be something like, for example, a Varga Lord with a bunch of Golter in it, just so that you have more things that make use of that ability. And frankly, Golter and basically the entire Varga Lord warband, because of his abilities, is just incredibly high utility in any case. Now, that critique notwithstanding, we move on to Warband 4, which is a Jotnar Cedar, very powerful character. He has shifted to heavy recently, and that's a little bit of a blow, but tenacious and hardened on that many wounds with that kind of defense. It's just a good character. He's just really durable. He punches on really nicely. Expensive, yes, but extremely worthwhile. And then a Mountain Jotnar, because you have to have a Mountain Jotnar. That does put the list at 2 heavies, but the list also has kind of ample light and plenty of mediums. And so, hey, the Mountain Jotnar, 2/3 of the time will be turning up on turn 4, not necessarily the end of the world, kind of okay as the price to unlock the Jotnar Cedar, which is a very good character. So overall, I do think this list is definitely just missing make the Volya into the Warlord. It's leaving so much money on the table for so little benefit that I really don't know why the Blooded is the Warlord. To the point that I almost suspect that potentially of being a misclick prior to list submission. But if we set that aside, the list is otherwise doing a good mix of somewhat mixed Nord things. My personal preference for playing Nords is to really heavily focus on the light and medium. I think that Raiders are great, but more importantly than that, I think their spellcasting is excellent. I think they can hit very high activation counts, and I think that the Varga Lord warband is one of the most powerful warbands in the game and is just so strong that you should be trying to maximize that in almost every Nord list if you're playing competitively. That's just a personal opinion though. This list is obviously not trying to do that. It's running much more balanced. It's got a nice mix of giants and humans. and with a mix of early scoring, some ability to punch on, and generally dangerous characters, probably will do serviceably, but not as well, I think, as if it had maybe been optimized slightly more, at minimum just having that Volya Warlord over the Blooded. Now, in comparison to Alan's well-rounded but maybe slightly less than optimal Nords list, we have Scott's a 100% meme build. And that's totally fine. There is a place in any event for 100% meme builds, and if you're lucky, they are somewhere at about the halfway mark in terms of placings. That is kind of the price you pay for running a list like this, but the payoff is you get to run a list like this, which is maximum possible giant count. So we start with the first of two Jotnar Cedars. He has a Mountain Jotnar and a Sea Jotnar, so that's a 3 heavy regiment list so far. We then have a single Shaman as the Warlord, which actually will benefit the 2 Raider in Captain regiments in the Shaman's Warband, and then he has a Sea Jotnar, so that is our 4th giant. We then have another Jotnar Cedar with, oh look, 2 more Mountain Jotnars. That makes this a 7 giant regiment. No mediums. This list has 7 giants and 7 heavy regiments and 2 lights. Now, yes, this list is absolutely a meme build. This list is present because it's really funny to put that many giants on a list, on a table. But before we disregard it on those grounds, let's actually just stop and think about what this list is actually capable of doing. Yes, those raiders will be hugely exposed and will not want to risk moving forward too aggressively early in the game. Under the most ideal of circumstances, they grab a home zone and they just chill there until all the big boys arrive. If those raiders overextend, there will be no support available to them until turn 3, at which point, if they will just be overexposed, they will jump, they will die. Wadhrun lists, even the less light-centric Wadhrun lists will clean that up. There are city-states lists that we're going to see that will just take them out before the giants can come and save them. So they have to play relatively conservatively. However, when the giants begin arriving, interesting things happen to the game, because the thing about the giants, okay, yes, it's going to take them a while to turn up. Assuming moderately average dice, you will probably have 3 of them appear on turn 3, and then often it'll be 3 more appear on turn 4, and the last one will arrive on turn 5. That would be a fairly usual reinforcement roll, although there's a fair bit of volatility in that. You could have a variety of different things happening. Now, the thing about the giants as a heavy spam archetype is that you have a list that is comprised entirely of monsters. And there are 2 notable advantages that monsters just have generally, and which are present here in spades. The first is that they do not degrade. If any of these giants gets very, very badly wounded, if it finishes off its target or it's relieved by a friendly giant coming in and smashing up whoever's fighting it, it can pull back and go and sit on a zone somewhere and be like, yep, cool, all this giant is doing now for the rest of the game is scoring. This is a Sea Jotnar that has taken 14 wounds, no problem, it's pulling back and it's sitting on a zone. And the value that you've kind of banked, all of the effort that you've put into killing that Sea Jotnar, well, it's driven it back, but it hasn't killed it. The Jotnar is still alive, it is still scoring, it's still an activation, and in a pinch it could charge in and attack you again in a later turn. So monsters are very binary between being any number of wounds and dead. They are fully effective at any number of wounds. That's something that this list can really play to its advantage. The probably more important thing is the broader question of force concentration. You can put in a very small footprint a very, very large amount of force in this list. Even the mildest of those giants is very dangerous. They all have a lot of cleave. They are all terrifying. They are all difficult to kill. And what that means is that whatever your list might be, whatever you are fighting them with, if you are running like a regular infantry block and it is spreading out, it is very, very easy for that infantry block to be ganged up on by 2 or even 3 giants. And there are very few infantry or cavalry regiments in the game that can outfight 2 or 3 giants. Now, okay, sure, you'll have force elsewhere. Your infantry will be cheaper than those 2 or 3 giants. But force concentration destroys armies. You are not going to win that fight, and the giants will move on to the next engagement, and then the next engagement, and they will eat you up piecemeal because they can concentrate force so aggressively. This also has effect cycles in certain terrain boards. I have seen this list in play. I've seen a picture of a game that featured this list, and the table, for lack of a better term, was one of those tables that you get where you turn up at the club and all they have is 40k terrain, which in Conquest terms just turns into impassable. Now, I suspect at Clash we'll have a nice broad array of terrain. Some of the locals are bringing things down, but every now and again in Conquest, you just hit that abomination of a table that the TO didn't really think about when he was setting up, and which the terrain is just 6 impassable terrain pieces. Right? It's the someone 3D printed off a bunch of Parabellum terrain, and 100% of Parabellum 3D printable terrain is impassable, and so they just put a bunch of the Dweghom or Old Dominion terrain on a table, and now the terrain, the table just has 6 pieces of impassable terrain on it, which hugely constrains mobility. Except if you're running a list that is comprised almost entirely of monsters, and you can force concentrate into those gaps really, really easily, and they're mobile, and they're maneuverable because their turning circles are limited. Now, does this mean I think this list is a snapshot to win the event? No, absolutely not. It has 7 regiments. It's 7 heavy regiments. It's going to have a game, which it's going to play Maelstrom at some point or something, right? We're just going to draw Maelstrom, and the Raiders are going to be pushed back, and it's just not going to score for the first 5 turns of the game. And then it's going to lose. That's going to happen at some point. That is the nature of playing this list. But I think this list will also have games where, oh yeah, this is a scenario that you can recover on kill points, doesn't score that much that early, the Raiders are able to safely contest a zone, like we're playing Echelon or something. And then the trees begin to shake, and there is the sound of drums, and then you realize that the earth is reverberating, and the terrain just kind of stops you from playing a really wide list, and then there are 2 giants walking through one little pass, and there are 2 giants walking through another, and you can't fight them all at the same time, and they do just, over the course of 10 turns, crush through a list. Now, genuinely, I would expect this list to go 3 and 2, 2 and 3, but to have a cool time doing all of that, and it might, with the right rolls, the right tables, the right scenarios, actually threaten to do a little better. And it will almost certainly look hella stylish the entire time that it is doing it. Now, our final Nord list is Jacob's list, and this is the closest to what I would probably consider to be normal Nords. Although, as noted, I am on record as thinking that the Varga's warband is just the most powerful warband in Nords, and should probably be in every single Nords list, and it isn't present here either. But with that as a caveat, we do have a Volya Warlord, Coils of the Serpent, and Valkyrie. These are going to be Evasion 2 Valkyries, and it's a big block of 5, which means that they've got a big block of 5 with Evasion 2 and Blessed. It's just very difficult to punch through under any circumstance. That's a nice solid brick. Now, if you are a Nords player, one of the really interesting things about the Volya is that she has both Valkyries and Huskarls as mainstays in her warband, and the units are identically costed and scale up in cost identically, which means that you really get to pick. And if you're ever wondering which of the two do you take, a good rule of thumb is, well, firstly, how shooting heavy is the meta going to be? Because the Huskarls have Untouchable, which means that they have a rule that works against shooting, and the Valkyries don't. Other than that, if you are thinking about scaling up, the Valkyries are going to be better. Volya, unlike some priests, actually does fight fairly well, and so you can consider, particularly with her spells, etc., putting her in a bigger regiment. Valkyries scale up a little bit more than Huskarls. Huskarls have the impact, but Valkyries have support. The big thing is that the Volya can bless her regiment. Valkyries already have Blessed, but a Volya is only Priest 6. Yes, she is devout, but it becomes kind of easy to start failing that spellcasting roll some of the time, particularly if interference is in place. And so while the Huskarls can become almost better versions of the Valkyries, thanks to being able to cast Blessed, Valkyries just always have Blessed and have support, which frees up the Volya's spellcasting to do things like heal, for example, and healing is very, very powerful. Valkyries are just going to be more consistent at that higher level of unit size, right? That higher stand count. Huskarls are better either if you are playing into a lot of range attacks, or you expect to, or are running a smaller count of stands. We then have a Konungur with no upgrades. That's totally fine. He absolutely does not need any. The man is a beast. He will most likely be joining that unit of 3 Steel Chosen, and then we have 3 Bow Chosen and 3 Bow Chosen. Now, Bow Chosen are the most dangerous range unit in Nords, particularly if you give them Opportunist with the Konungur. Yep, that's nice. It's a good solid synergy. I do, from my money, think that probably that entire warband should just be replaced with a Varga Lord, because the Varga Lord's warband is so strong. Golter are so good. He is so powerful. The upgrades he gives are so good. But if you want to run actual ranged regiments, for example, and good ranged regiments at that, the Konungur is also a really premium character by himself. The 120 points gets you an absolute beater, so fair enough. I don't think it's my personal pick for most optimal, but it is very sound. We've then got a second Volya. Again, no upgrades, but no need to. And with the addition of the second Volya, we actually do start to see, hey, here is some merit to the Konungur's regiment. All of that talk about Golter are so good, and Golter are really, really good, by the way. The Volya, particularly in a Warlord, a Volya Warlord list, all spellcasters can target any regiment on any friendly regiment on a zone regardless of distance, and Volyas have got a really good heal in the form of Fruit of the Golden Tree. That spell, however, can only target infantry, and so if you want to maximize your ability to put out 2 powerful healing spells per round, well, you can't do that on brutes, you can't do that on cavalry. Okay, there we go. That's kind of the case. That's genuinely the use case for things like the Coninger and the Steel Chosen. If you want to be able to heal your brawler punchy regiments that are moving forward and taking territory, they do need to be infantry. Now, you can have a Nord list that has Golter and has the Vargo Lord, and then has things like Berserks, which are terrifying to heal. Raiders, frankly, are annoying to heal as well, particularly in a Volya Warlord list. So I don't generally think you would be short on targets, but if you want really maximal flexibility, the Coninger is one of the ways to do that. Speaking of raiders, we have raiders without a captain and raiders with a captain in the Volya's list. I actually like that that's a thing. I have found that there is a tendency in Nord lists to take lots of raiders and put captains in all of them. You don't need to do that. All a captain does is let the regiment score, which is really good, but there's only going to be so many zones, only going to be so many places. Having raider regiments that actually can be sent out expendably and don't cost 20 extra points over a baseline, they're really efficient combat units at that point, particularly with +1 evasion from the supremacy. And so if you need to cut 20 points, I think that's a really sensible place to do it. And given the number of raiders in this list, right, we've got, I think, 4 raider regiments? Yep, 4 raider regiments. There is no need for all of them to have captains. In this case, 3 of them have captains, so we will see probably one free-running unit of raiders with a captain, the Volya in a unit with a captain, the Shaman here in a unit with a captain. Shaman's bringing along a mountain yacht for the ride, just 1 heavy, that's totally fine. The list will just pretty reliably be all present by turn 3. But yeah, there is just no need for 4 raider regiments to all have the ability to score. You're not going to need that over the course of the game, and having 1 unit that can be like, no, they're not bound to an objective zone, they can just go and fight. Some other raiders will hold that zone, I think is a sensible way to save just a few points and hit the 2,000 point limit. So overall, this list of the 3 definitely strikes me as the most well-rounded. Yes, I do think the Coninger is a little bit of an edge case, but the Steel Chosen definitely synergizes with the Volya Supremacy. All of the elite infantry synergize nicely with access to Volya healing, and you have just a real rush up the table early on. This list will be on zones, it'll be taking them aggressively, and it'll be holding them into the late game with things like the Valkyries. That lets this list transition between fighting and scoring, and you will be able to play games with this list where you seize a bunch of points early with the Raiders, you follow up onto those zones with things like the Valkyries, and then the Valkyries just hold for a really, really long time. And having things like Valkyries as an anvil lets the Bow Chosen with Opportunist play nicely as well, because Opportunist likes nothing more than to hold an enemy in place for a time. And so there's just a good, clean plan for how this list is going to play. It's leaving a tiny little bit of Nord mechanical strength on the table. There is a notable absence of Berserks with Savages. There is a notable absence of Golter, but the things that are present are good and sound, and my expectation is that this list will broadly perform pretty well. Up next, we move on into Dweghom, and there is a slightly unexpected variety of warlords here. No Ardent Creed, but we are going to see a couple of lists with a Hold Reg warlord, which is something of a more modern emergence. 2 lists, however, will be playing Tempered, but 1 Tempered Steel Shaper and 1, I believe, Tempered Sorcerer. Tempered Sorcerer being the classic Dweg, but Dweg are experimenting around that kind of for a reason. Now, the Dweghom are getting a rework, probably not this update, probably the next one, so we will see a major Dweg rework in about August. But between now and then, there is ample strength in the faction for people to play with, and we're going to see that on display here. Now, the first list we have is Alberto's Dweghom, and this is the Tempered Steel Shaper list. The Tempered Steel Shaper as a warlord is one of my favorite Dweghom warlords because the ability to heal back, it's the only way to get access to healing in Dweghom. And there are a bunch of units in Dweghom on which healing is very high value. Now, we're going to see a little bit of personalization in this list. There's going to be a few things where it's like, this is maybe not the best thing in the game, but the miniature is really cool, etc. And that's going to start with a Ferric Throne Tempered Steel Shaper. So we have a Tempered Steel Shaper. He has Graft of Fire, which is effectively just he is Wizard 8. The Graft of Fire has a bunch of text. That text only matters if you're playing a different kind of character who can fail resolve checks. The Tempered Steel Shaper can't, so he's Wizard 8. Fantastic. He's then going to have Ferric Throne, which means he's going to be riding the Stoneforged. Now, the Stoneforged is a regiment that I personally respect, But you have to be kind of careful in terms of how it synergizes with the Tempered Creed generally, and that's kind of the problem with it. Tempered Creed, particularly Tempered Steel Shaper lists, want to be generating as many tokens as possible because those tokens are higher value than they are anywhere else. If you have a Tempered Sorcerer list, you'll be able to cast more spells and therefore generate more tokens, but those tokens don't heal, whereas they do with a Tempered Steel Shaper. Putting one of your characters who generates tokens in a heavy regiment means that they aren't on the board, they can't spend the tokens, they can't generate the tokens until turn 3. That's kind of a problem, but we will see how Alberto accommodates that later in the list with Ardent Kerouacs. Now, the payoff is that you get a regiment that is really kind of cool and is good at spending tokens. But again, the Stoneforged kind of doesn't necessarily synergize with the Tempered Steel Shaper Warlord. If you have a non-Steel Shaper Warlord list, like a regular Tempered list, the Stoneforged is almost better in that respect, because the Stoneforged really wants to spend tokens. If it spends enough tokens, it pushes it over, it gets blessed, becomes very, very dangerous, and all of that is super cool. But you must, in a Steel Shaper list, Steel Shaper Warlord list, you must really carefully spend your tokens to maximize the healing. That's what makes it powerful. It's actually a really good Warlord. And so having a Stoneforged, which is like, it's really only good if it gets to suck down like 3 tokens a turn, is directly at odds with what you're trying to do with the rest of the list. So I honestly think the Stoneforged here is kind of present as a, this miniature is really cool and I want to use it, and I fully respect that. My personal take is that the Stoneforged best place is in a non-Steel Shaper regular Tempered Sorcerer list if you want to do that, but that Tempered Steel Shaper Warlords in general have a tremendous amount of potential and are one of the best Warlords in Dweghom. So, okay, small thing to consider. Alberto has played with this list, he's relatively comfortable with it, and the model is cool as hell, so fair cop. And there is frankly mechanical benefit to playing things that are fun and which you think are cool. That's not me taking the piss. You practice better, you have a better time, you are more engaged and therefore more mentally on if you're having a good time. That's just the long and the short of it. A miserable person performs less well at events than a happy person, and so for God's sake, just take regiments that you think are cool within certain reason, and a Stoneforged is absolutely within that reason. We have a minimum unit of Hold Ballistae, just necessary in order to unlock the Stoneforged. Then we have a second Steel Shaper. This Steel Shaper has more of what I would consider to be the kind of ideal warband for a Steel Shaper Warlord list, which is Fireforged and Steelforged. The Tempered Steel Shaper himself joins the Fireforged. He adds to their gun battery. They, in turn, are a very good escort for him because their defensive stats are sufficient. He doesn't add to the resolve of a regiment. I mean, he does in terms of unit size, but because he doesn't have a resolve stat, he doesn't confer that auto-pass morale checks to a regiment. And because he doesn't confer that, you need a regiment that is natively durable. And so Fireforged are a very, very good home to Tempered Steel Shaper, and Steelforged are a very good recipient of Steel Shaper buffs. Hardened is outstanding on them, Clash is kind of gratuitous on them, Hardened most of the time is what you will cast, or minus defense on enemy regiments. They're also, because they are natively defense 4 and resolve 4 and can be given Hardened, an outstanding, possibly they're one of the 2 best regiments to benefit from healing in a Tempered Steel Shaper list. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the only regiment that is more frustrating to deal with being healed and being given hardened by a Tempered Steel Shaper is when I played against at an event recently, which is an Ironclad Drake. I didn't think about the fact that you can give Hardened 1 and Tempered tokens to heal and auto-pass resolve checks to an Ironclad. Like, the second part I knew, but Hardened on an Ironclad actually caught me by surprise, and I very nearly went down in that game. After 2 of those damn things picked up Hardened and got boosted through my shooting to yeet into me on like turn 4, and it was an absolute scramble for the rest of the game. However, you need to stretch your list considerably to get Ironclad Drakes plural into a Tempered Steel Shaper list. There's a lot of finagling that goes into that, and you do limit your token generation, whereas Steelforged fit very neatly into a Steel Shaper warband, and frankly, for practical purposes, if I was going to say I want to take a Steel Shaper Warlord myself, most of my warbands would be Fireforged and then either Steelforged or Magmaforged, depending on what I can afford, and that would be the basis of the units I was going to heal. Now, the rest of the list would probably look a little similar to what Alberto is doing. I mentioned one of the problems, right, one of the challenges with putting a Tempered Steel Shaper in a Tempered Steel Shaper Warlord list on a Stoneforged is that you delay your token generation. Alberto has chosen to manage that by front-loading a bunch of token generation with Ardent Kerouacs. And so this list, although it's a Tempered Creed list, then just has like the whole rest of the list is going to be Ardent. They can't spend tokens. Ardent Kerouac don't generate the auras that allow you to spend the tokens, so you have to quite carefully shepherd your army with your Steel Shapers. But they do generate tokens, and we're going to see 2 Ardent Kerouacs who can join light regiments if they want to, otherwise arrive as mediums, which means that you actually generate a sufficient depth of tokens in this list to truly maximize the Steel Shaper's Warlord ability. So we have the first Ardent Kerouac. He has Invocation of the Shattering, which is a draw event on him, which gives flawless strikes to his regiment. Usually that means he'll be joining Flame Berserkers, and then Flaming Oratory, which gives Tenacious, which really helps make models like Flame Berserkers, for example, be more durable. We then have an MSU of Flame Berserkers and an MSU of Magma Forge. The Ardent could join either of those. If you join the Flame Berserkers, you get to make them scoring, you generate tokens earlier in the game. That would frankly be my go-to. I would put the Ardents in the Flame Berserkers, because the tokens are just so high value and the early scoring is really nice, and having 2 Ardents in 2 Flame Berserker regiments, plus the extra light, means that they'll usually arrive on turn 1 and just start that token generation. They don't have to do anything else. They could just get onto his own and score if they wanted to, but they should play conservatively, build up that token bank, and then push forward later in the game, where you have that depth of tokens to weather through a huge amount of enemy attacks. Similarly then, in the second group, we've got Ardent Kerouac, Flame Berserkers, and Wardens. Yeah, look, frankly, Wardens, for my money, could just as easily be Magma Forged. I think the over-under on those regiments, they are both medium, they are both, in this case, can be taken. Magma Forged are restricted, Wardens are mainstay, but you have the slot to take a restricted. Really, just your mileage may vary on which of the 2 you prefer. I think I very lightly prefer the Magma Forged. The defensive stats are identical. The Wardens are actually probably a bit more dangerous offensively. The Magma Forge need Aura of Death to close the gap, basically. 6 attacks cleave 1 is better than 4 attacks cleave 2, but the Magma Forge have a Standard Bearer built in, and that's just a really nice thing to have. Your mileage really may vary. You can use either or both. There is genuine merit to not duplicating cards under some circumstances, because you can't get yourself locked into bad plans if a unit dies too early. Either way, they are close to interchangeable in this case. They're just solid medium regiments that are dangerous in their own merits and good recipient of Steelforged tokens. So I think this list is built well in a way to accommodate the presence of a Tempered Steel Shaper on Stoneforged. Once you've committed to not just the Tempered Steel Shaper on Stoneforged, but that he be your Warlord, then the 2 Ardent Kerouac gets you all of the tokens you need to maximize the Tempered Steel Shaper's presence, and generally do, to an even greater extent than usual, the thing that so infuriates people playing against Tempered Creed, which is they just bank the tokens and maybe take a little bit of damage, and then weather through far more than you ever expected them to over the course of a turn or 2, and blunt an offense that you thought would break through their defenses, and then roll you up and beat you down. Now, Alberto, I know, is a newer player. I played against him in the last event that we both attended. It was a really lovely game, but he is still learning the game. But I think the list that he's got here, if he plays it well, evidences a really good understanding of what the mechanical elements he needs are to succeed with some of the pieces that he's chosen. And if he can make that work, I think he'll do quite well. Our next Dweghom player is local Tom. Tom's our Vanguard, very experienced player. And it's here that we see our first Hold Reg Warlord list. Now, if you put a gun to Tom's head, he would probably tell you that the most powerful in general way to play Dweghom is to play Tempered Creed, lots of dangerous spells, lots of shooting, build a box, control the space that the box is in, move forward across the table, win the game, etc. However, that doesn't mean that's the only way to play Dweghom, and there is an emergent tactic that has kind of cropped up over the last few months, which is a Hold Reg Warlord list. Now, where a Tempered character would give you access to the Tempered Creed, and an Ardent character gives you access to the Ardent Creed, the Hold Reg gives you access to Get Fucked You Don't Get a Creed, but his Supremacy ability is transformative. It's character and regiments in the army, characters and regiment command stands count as 2 additional scans for purposes of seizing objective zones. That means that a character counts as 2 or 3 stands, depending on if they're in a light regiment or not, and a regiment's command stand counts as 2 or 3 stands, again depending on whether they're light or not, which means something like an Ardent Kerouac in Flame Berserkers, without casting any spells, counts as 4 stands for purposes of seizing zones, which means it outscores by itself, with no additional influence, an enemy MSU. In addition, if the Hold Reg himself is in a medium or heavy regiment, it just always seizes a zone that it's in. And this produces a really interesting and different scenario-focused style of play. And I've asked Tom about this. And his basic take is he's very good at playing box Dweghom, where you build a line of infantry and then you put two enormous cannon drakes behind it, and you cast a bunch of spells and you blow your opponent up if they run at you, and you seize that little bit of territory slowly and try and contest other parts of the table. But generally, you build a big, dangerous gun box and you move it across the table, taking territory as you go. Tom is very, very good at playing that style of list. He has run it in many events. He is the best player I am aware of personally at piloting it. He's got a really good eye for the distances and the way that you can actually have the formation move, because it's not easy always to make overlapping regiments move forward properly. Tom can do it. However, that's kind of the challenge. He can do it. He can do that in his sleep. And that's actually sort of stopped being kind of interesting for him. He wants something novel. That's a very reasonable thing to want. We crave exploration, we crave novelty, we crave play in games that we play. And this is a list that, in his own words, makes him think about the fundamentals of playing the game, because this is primarily kind of a fast, melee-centric, very heavy emphasis on scoring style of list. Is it more powerful than a Tempered Creed list? It depends. Does it require Tom to think differently about the game, exercise different parts of his brain? Does it supply novelty? Yes, and that's a really significant thing. I mean, I just mentioned that you will perform better if you're having fun. You're more mentally engaged, you're alert, you're able to play for longer, you're able to practice more. Like, these are big, in addition to the intrinsic benefits of fun, which I feel shouldn't need to be explained, there are actually genuine performance benefits to having a good time, and that's a really good reason to play this list. And so, with all of that said, what's going on in this list? Well, it's a Reg Warlord list, as mentioned, which means that everything here needs to be read through the prism of aggressively scoring. So we have an Ardent Kerouac, Flame Berserkers, Magma Forged. I actually don't know where the Ardent is going there. He doesn't need to go in the Flame Berserkers. He could. If you wanted to put him in the Flame Berserkers, that regiment would count as 4 stands for scoring, which means, as mentioned, it will outscore a light MSU that might be trying to contest it. But while an Ardent would often go in Flame Berserkers because he has a spell that lets them score, that's not necessary here. And so you could instead choose to safely put him in Magma Forged, where he also contributes sort of, to the regiment in terms of size, adding a little bit of offense, etc. Just from the extra stand, you can play 4 wide. You actually have the choice, and you might make that choice at the beginning of the game. You could choose which regiment to put the Ardent in. Our second warband is the same as our first warband. So already we can see 2 dangerous medium regiments and 4 dangerous scoring light regiments. Excellent. If you compare one of those units of Flame Berserkers to an only 20 points cheaper unit of Raiders, the Raiders are good, but they are not outperforming in terms of combat those Flame Berserkers. We then get the Hold Reg himself, and there are no special rules on him whatsoever, but there are no special items on either of the Ardent either. That's interesting. We are cutting every possible point that we can, and in fact he is just joining a MSU of Hold Warriors. He'll add a little bit of offense there, but what he will mostly do is he will turn up off of a reinforcement line set by the Flame Berserkers and then auto-seize a zone. Doesn't matter what you have in it. This list has got many activations, so it can often quite reliably have something like have the last activation of turn 2 be, or even turn 3, be the Hold Reg, walk onto the table, you don't have the ability to respond anymore, and he just zooms into a zone and cheekily scores it and flips points that you thought were like otherwise going to be yours. Another unit of Hold Warriors, and the second unit of Hold Warriors is a mainstay, which unlocks Ironclad Drake, Ironclad Drake. Ironclad Drakes are very, very good. They're very, very scary. There is no force multiplication for them in this list. There is no Tempered Creed, etc. They are a little bit vulnerable to being focused fired and put down. However, they are a force multiplier to all of the rest of the list because everything in the list is melee, and that means that the command stands get Flurry from the Ironclad Drake's aura, which is actually going to be in play here. And so this means we have a list that is not easy to play, right? This is 10 melee regiments, no ranged, no offensive spellcasting. The list is all melee, but every single thing in the list scores, and in fact, most things in the list can potentially aggressively outscore light regiments that might be contesting them. The Reg himself can outscore anything, and that means you have this hybrid game that you're playing. The first is it's Dweghom, it's good melee, it's great melee in the case of the Drakes, good force concentration, things are dangerous, the list can punch on. But the list is probably not going to beat in terms of attritional advantage, many more well-rounded lists that might be engaging it. Lists that have got ranged attacks and offensive spellcasting, and a variety of offensive tools, right? This list doesn't compete with those lists on that basis. It will try and overwhelm them in melee, it will try and engage and kill, but more than that, you win Conquest by having the most points at the end of the game. And one of the things this list is trying to do is turn after turn, make sure that it's accumulating that scenario advantage that you can't overcome. Now, not every scenario will necessarily allow that. Scenarios with this is a hugely rare example of a Dweghom list that is not very, 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 very good in head-to-head, for example, which is a scenario with effectively one zone. By comparison, Tempered Creed lists are sodding outstanding in that kind of scenario because they just build the box and walk into the zone and you have to fight them on their terms. This list doesn't do that. But in many, many other scenarios, the broad scoring potential doesn't really care if the reg dies either. Like, his job can literally be to score a zone that you thought was yours for 1 or 2 turns. If he dies after that, he has made enough scenario points to justify himself. And so what we have overall is a list that, at least in Australia, is a little bit new to see, and is playing on a style that people will not be familiar with Dweg, and requires a really good understanding of the fundamentals of force allocation and maneuver, because there is no forgiveness in the list otherwise. There is no like ranged pressure, there's no spellcasting pressure. Everything is a melee unit. Everything has to position to fight, everything has to be played well in that respect in order to just hold your ground in the combat part of the game. But if you do that, nothing in the game scores like this list. Nothing has a stronger scoring game, period, as this list. And that's super interesting. Now, having said all of that, hey look, it's our second hold reg list. This is Ryan's list. I'm not sure if I know Ryan, but this list is doing kind of similar things, and we will see many of the same themes, but a slightly less wide list. This list has a hold reg warlord. He has the Mimnatz's Eye, and I genuinely had to look that up because I had no idea what it does. It gives +1 resolve and fearless to the regiment the character is attached to. Now, he is going to be in that big unit of initiates, which makes that big unit of initiates resolve 1,000,000 and fearless, and they are defense 3 and they have shields. What is that regiment going to do? It's going to touch a zone, and then it's going to score it for the rest of the game. Now, if we compare that, for example, to Tom's list, which is wider and has more early game scoring, and has the hold reg in an MSU of warriors, Tom's list is looking to have the hold reg score for 1 or 2 turns, then probably die. This list, from there, we have Hold Ballistae, Ironclad Drake, Ironclad Drake. Ironclad Drakes are really good. We then have a second hold reg in a smaller but still very durable unit of initiates. Again, touch a zone. This is not the Warlord's Regiment, so it does not auto-score, but it does still have a hold reg that counts as 3 stands and an initiate command stand that counts as 3 stands. So if you get the 2 of them in contact with the zone, that's 6 stands, which very nearly auto-scores. And then hold warriors. And I'll be honest, I hadn't actually scrolled down and read the rest of the list at this point, but I am disappointed to see Fireforged. What I was hoping to see was 2 more Ironclad Drakes. That would have been the Chad move, if, maybe not necessarily the best. Instead, we've got, Fireforged, so that's some ranged along with the Hold Ballistae. Just a little bit of tickle at range, which is quite nice. Fireforged are good, like they punch, well, they don't punch on, but they're a good ranged battery and counter battery regiment. Then we have an Ardent Kerouac, Flame Berserkers. So these Flame Berserkers are going to be trying to do the same thing that the larger quantity of Berserkers is doing in Tom's list. Broadly, this is very similar thematically in terms of what's trying to be accomplished. This list has got, I think, marginally fewer activations. Probably 1 fewer. I think Tom's is 13, this is 12, still a good healthy count. But where Tom's list is playing very wide in terms of regiments, this list just concentrates things down a little bit to have those durable initiate regiments and a little bit of range. But it's those initiate regiments that are the big change between this list and Tom's. Tom's list is banking on the fact that his list is wider and has more activations, and all of those regiments are potentially powerful at scoring. This list, Ryan's list, has these initiates, if they get to a zone, they're never leaving. Those initiates, if they get to a zone, they're probably never leaving either. So it has anchor regiments that can score and hope to hold through multiple turns of combat, whereas Tom is playing more of a no individual unit is quite as important. But many of the individual units, because there are things like Magma Forged, for example, are a bit more dangerous. Just 2 sides of the same coin, 2 different ways to approach the reg supremacy. Just different levels of aggression versus conservative play. Tom's list is more aggressive, really aggressively scores in some cases. Ryan's list is a bit more, we're going to go the distance a little bit more. We're going to hold and score and hold and score and hold and score. Finally, our last list, this is Ish Isaac from Naura's list, and this is running what I would consider to be, but this is classic box Dweg. This is the list that I was talking about. It is the borderline classic double Hellbringer Sorcerer. So many of you will have seen lists like this in the past. They're very good for a reason, and it is Tempered Sorcerer Warlord riding a Hellbringer Drake with Magma School and then some Hold Warriors. Tempered Sorcerer, Magma, Hellbringer Sorcerer, Fireforged Hellbringer. So 2 big gun drakes that are very tall and can see over things in the way, and some things to stand in the way. We then have Tempered Steel Shaper in Hold Ballisto. Generates more tokens, is on the board early, makes units around him durable, just a good range of buff spells to complement the Tempered Sorcerer and another spellcaster, and then the Ardent Kerouac. So this gives us Tempered Sorcerer casting 2 spells a turn, Tempered Sorcerer casting 1, and because they're Magma School, they can always cast lots of spells. Steel Shaper and Ardent. As early as turn 2, it is very possible for this list to be generating 5 tokens every single turn. And so compared to, for example, a Steel Shaper led list where the tokens are higher value because they also have a healing effect, this list just generates an absolute ton of them. Over the course of a game, you could potentially see 30 or 40 tokens generated, which is 30 or 40 auto-passed armor or resolve checks. Now, the Ardent has the largest warband of the 3, with Flame Berserkers, Wardens, and Initiates. You would usually see the Ardent in this case in the Flame Berserkers because that produces early scoring, but I think Ish actually has a tendency to run in the Initiates, and that's frankly pretty reasonable. You can actually just make the choice depending on the scenario. If you think you need to really guarantee, like whatever you think the play is, you could kind of choose to make. The absolute worst case scenario is that depending on how your medium reinforcement rolls go, you can still just bring the Ardent on turn 2 in the Initiates and then cast the spell at range onto the Flame Berserkers to let them score. The most important wizard that turns up on turn 2 is usually going to be the Warlord Steel Shaper, the Warlord Tempered Sorcerer, because he generates the most tokens, but you've only got to succeed with a few. The Steel Shaper's ordered on turn 1. And so your absolute worst case ran out with this list is still a lot of the times going to be 1 spellcaster arrives on turn 1, 2 spellcasters arrive on turn 3, and the 3rd spellcaster arrives on turn 3. So 1 on turn 1, 2 on turn 2, if you put the Ardent in Initiates, which is pretty sensible, frankly, much of the time, and then the 3rd spellcaster on turn 3, which still gives you lots of token ramp up and is really, really strong. This is box Dweg at its basic finest. You've got multiple units that all serve as solid screens for the Hellbringers, and the Hellbringers just spew out gunfire and range spells at really long range. It's good. Most people will have played against something like this at some point in the past, which means that the onus basically is on Ish to know how to play this better than people know how to play against it. But this is one of those lists that, in the right circumstances, in the right scenario, feels just one of the strongest lists in the game. Not all of the time. The significant weakness of this list is that it doesn't like to spread out. A very good rule of thumb is that if there's one forest on the table anywhere on Ish's side of the board, both Hellbringers will be sitting in there, which means that the list is somewhat predictable in terms of its positioning, and so the suffering versus payoff of the list really does tend to come down to, can the Hellbringer and infantry box be built in a location that can subsequently push out along a path that wins the game. If it can't, if there's no forest, if there's no obscuring terrain, and there's enemy counter battery fire, or if there is such aggressive early pressure that potentially the box can't be established in time, or if there is a list that can theoretically zone out or even just endure the Dweg shooting, it can run into issues. It can be a little bit susceptible to mechanical counter, and it can be a little bit susceptible to play counter, because it is one of those lists that if it has to stretch itself away from the cover offered by the Hellbringers, a lot of the power begins to wane. You really want to keep everything together, which limits the tempered tokens that can be spent, like etc. But if you play it in a way that mitigates those weaknesses and maximizes the strengths, the mechanical strengths at their apex are just extremely strong. Now, from Dweg, we proceed into city-states, and a few times over the course of this video, I have mentioned lists potentially in city-states that can potentially engage you very aggressively on your part of the table very early in the game. And so it's time to introduce Michael from Canberra's list. Now, I call this list the Bahubali Catapult. He calls it Thorites, and it is genuinely fascinating in terms of how it plays. It is not without weakness, but let me just break down for you what's in it and then how those pieces go together. The first thing we have is an Aristarch Warlord. The Aristarch has Blades of Achilles, which is going to give him very, very, very big cleave, but more importantly, he has Initiative, which is possibly the most powerful mastery in the game. Initiative, if his regiment comes off the strat stack, gives any friendly infantry or brute regiment within, I think, 10 inches of the Aristarch a free maneuver or reform. That is, every single turn, because the Aristarch is in Thorikides who arrive on turn 1, provided you dedicate the strat stack position to the Aristarch, you get a free out-of-sequence move on one of your units. That is hugely powerful and allows certain plays that just would not be possible otherwise. So the Aristarch is in a unit of Thorikides that's just 3 Thorikides with a Minotaur Therian. However, to note that most of those Thorikides are extremely expendable because all of the damage in this unit comes from the Therian and the Aristarch. We're also going to see that the Therian scores because of combined arms drills, I expect to see later in the list. We then have a unit of Selenoi. The primary advantage of the Selenoi is that they are a light regiment that can safely arrive later and contribute to the battle because there are a bunch of lights we want to bring on. You could replace them with Thorikides, but for just a few points more, which the list can afford, the Selenoi gives you a little bit of roundedness, but usually if there is a light regiment that arrives late, it is the Selenoi. We then have a pair of Scorpios. The delta between Scorpios and Flogobolans these days is much less. I think both chariots kind of have some merit, but Scorpios still have longer range, and so in my money they are probably the better of the two in a vacuum, but chariots are very, very good. They're present here. Of particular note, this list can set a phenomenally aggressive reinforcement line on turn 1 if it needs to, because Thorikides have Vanguard and Initiative, which means the maximum distance if you really want to have a Thorikide regiment forward on turn 1 is literally 24 inches up the table if you use Initiative on the Aristarch's regiment, which means that those chariots can come in off the table edges on turn 2, 21.5 inches up the table, which is a really, really long way. Sorry, 22.5 inches. We then have, oh look, a third Scorpios, so it brings us up to 3 chariots in the list, but I think that's all, it's only going to be the 3. We then have a Polemarch with Primodynamic Globe, a very, very good ability, particularly, so it gives interference in a massive, massive range. Not just to his regiment, but it also allows other regiments nearby to count as wizards' purposes of interference, which is just hugely valuable in shutting down enemy spellcasting or limiting the damage of enemy spellcasting. Because even though your Thorikides regiments, and there are multiple of those in this list, can take quite a lot of wounds before they lose effectiveness, you still don't want to have them completely destroyed. You want to limit damage if you can, and the Primodynamic Globe very efficiently does that. We've then got Atlantis Spear, very good ability on the Polemarch. He's already got Flurry, large number of attacks with Cleave 1, adds damage very nicely to a Thorikides regiment, and Combined Arms Drills, which is very important in this list because it allows auxiliary stands to count as one more stand for purposes of scoring, which means that those Thorikides that are 24 inches up the field on the first turn count as scoring because the Minotaurs count as one stand. He is then in a unit of Thorikides with the Minotaur and has a unit of Saturoi. We'll probably be seeing more of those in a moment. Saturoi, if you're not familiar with them, are fluid formation, irregular, opportunist, cleave dudes with really high vanguard that can come in off the table edge regardless of reinforcement lines, which means that they can sneak into the back part of the table and sit behind you. A particularly nasty strategy being to actually really hug up against the back of a regiment so that it can't reform. Because when you reform, you spin on the spot, and if you spin on the spot, you would pass within 1 inch of the Saturoi, which means that if they are hugging up behind your butt like that, the only thing that you can do is first walk forward and then turn around, which means that they get to charge you without doing anything, which often spells the end of a regiment in any case. Finally, we have a third Polemarch in a unit of Agama with Sacred Band. Sacred Band are just a better version for the same cost as an extra stand of Agama. Sacred Band are just better in every single way, but they are an auxiliary stand. You can only have one of them, so fair enough. And then a second unit of Saturoi. Now, there are more and less extreme ways to build this list. My preferred version of the list actually runs, it doesn't run any Agama, but it does run 3 units of Thorikides. But it also doesn't run any Saturoi, it runs cows, Haspis, instead for a specific reason. However, that's all a little bit moot compared to what the list is going to do. If you have not played against this, let me break this down for you. The first thing that's going to happen is that it's going to have a lot of activations early. It's only a 12 activation list overall, but because it front loads most of those regiments aggressively, which means that characters are turning up, light regiments are turning up, and so early in the game, it's probably going to have activation supremacy. Particularly when we account for the fact that the command stand, the strategic stack that City States gets access to isn't exactly a free additional activation, but it's kind of like one, at least in terms of how it occurs in the turn. So they're going to bring a lot of lights on early, and they're probably going to have activation supremacy, which means that like the first 3 activations on the first turn will be strategic stack, Aristarch does a battlefield order, Polmite does a battlefield order. So you'll be 3, like the 4th activation deep before they commit a unit. During this time, you will have to have moved any light regiments that you have onto the field. They're then going to move one of the Thorakiti units onto the table, and then off the strat stack, they're going to bring on the Aristarch, who will come on, and having come off the strat stack, his unit gets additional speed, and the other Thorakiti's unit, which arrived this turn, he is going to use initiative probably to fling forward, either himself or the other Thorakiti's regiment. So let's say the other Thorakiti's regiment is the one that he flings forward. They will have moved forward 6 and 6 and 3, because they have Vanguard. So that's 15 inches, and then another 6 with initiative. So that's 21, right? The Aristarch himself can go 3 inches further because he'll have come off the strat stack, which gives him +1 march. But most likely, he'll be 20 inches up, the other regiment will be 21 inches up. That's a really long way forward. On turn 2, the situation is going to be kind of the same. You will probably not have activation superiority unless you're running a very specific kind of list, which means that if you move aggressively forward at all, like if you take any space at all, then in this case, the last 2 activations are going to be a unit doing something, then the Aristarch comes off the strat stack, and after coming off the strat stack, he is going to use initiative to move the unactivated Polemarch Thorakiti regiment forward, which means that rather than being 21 inches forward, they are now 27 inches forward. He can actually, if he needs to, use his supremacy to stagger things to make that 28 inches forward. No, not quite. Doesn't quite work that way. But anyway, you can get 1 point of speed out of it. So 27 inches forward, at which point they have not yet activated. They're then going to fluid formation to be 5 stands wide. They are going to fling one of those stands forward to close the distance between you and them, and they're going to charge you. On turn 2, within like a foot of your back table edge. This list, if there's any like light slinger regiment with a predator in it, that's a good unit. A chapter mage in a unit of crossbows. An Ardent Kerouac in a unit of Flame Berserkers has just innocently ambled onto the field and moved forward on turn 1 or turn 2. This unit can jump them. If you do not hug your back table edge, you are going to be engaged by a very dangerous Thorakiti regiment at the end of turn 2, who will probably get a pick, they'll probably kill that regiment, and then in a subsequent turn, if Michael wins the wins the supremacy roll, the same regiment that just killed one of your troops will activate, fluid formation wherever it needs to go, and charge and kill something else. Now, typically they won't be able to Pac-Man through an entire army, you will be able to respond eventually. But then the second regiment comes in, and then the Saturoi have arrived, and the Saturoi are sitting behind you, and the Thorakitis are sitting in front. If you are not prepared for this, the loss of tempo and battlefield control, and even though it actually isn't usually an attritional disadvantage, because these Thorakitis regiments are expensive, and although they can take a fair few wounds before they lose effectiveness, they still crumple like to a solid hit. And they're not quite dangerous to push through a strong unit aggressively, but they dominate the early game. What this tends to produce is a situation where actually Michael's list doesn't usually trade up in points early, but it eliminates key pieces that are part of your plan. They leave you off balance. Those Thorakiti units, like the Aristarchs, can pull back and score, then the Chariots arrive and they score. And so what Michael does is he sets the line of engagement so far towards your side of the table that even after this horrifically confused early engagement has occurred, you then have to actually move up the board and take the fights. And if you do that too incautiously, the Saturoi will hit you in the butt. And so what he is trying to do is just pin you back and hold you in place and get that kind of like just shred your army while he scores and scores and scores and scores and scores. And in the end of the game, it's very, very common, I have found playing against him, that as we move into like turn 6, I've just got more stuff left than he does. But the point score is a different matter entirely. Now, there are ways that you can play against this, and one of the reasons why I, in my version of this list, lean towards Haspist rather than Saturoi is that the counterplay against Saturoi and the counterplay against Thorakitis is the same, which is that you just hug your back table edge until everything is present. If you do that, the Saturoi can't get behind you, the Thorakides can't hit you until turn 3. You have just a little, you have to just give up space. You have to give up space and ground to get breathing room, and that means that you need to kiss the scenario goodbye until you have re-established that attritional advantage. Because the counterplay against Saturoi and the Thorakides is the same, I like to just dispense with the Saturoi and take things like Haspis instead, who, once you establish territory, the Haspis are really good at holding it for like a turn or two. That's just a personal preference, though. I think it rounds out the list a little bit better. I also spam more chariots than Michael does because he is a good and kind soul and not degenerate. But the list, regardless, is just super interesting to play against. I have done my best to prepare you, innocent viewer, for what it is that you will encounter if you play into this. The list is absolutely fragile. There is nothing in the list that is hugely durable. The toughest unit are the Agama, which are, durable enough, but we're not talking like an initiate brick here. But the list is hypermobile and it has good shooting and it's all over the place and it can reposition on a dime and its threat ranges are massive. And the very, very long and the short of it is, Michael has played this list a whole bunch, and you, dear viewer, have probably not played against it at all. Maybe you've played against it once. And so genuinely the best thing you can do is just be conservative, think every turn about whether you have moved too far forward. Do not think about the scenario or points until it's time. Until every city-state's regiment is on the table, just don't worry about the scenario. Just don't. It's a thing that will happen later. You just need to finish the game and get to turn 10 in a winning position. Trying to advance too quickly against this list is going to be your bane. It is a super cool and interesting list. There are a couple of different ways to play it. I really like it. I do think against a player that knows, like if you have enough reps against this and you're familiar with how to play it, this list needs to change its tactics. It needs to play a different game, and it does that with some difficulty. And so, for example, if Michael is playing against me, who has played many times, if he's playing against Tom, who has played many times, he'll probably have a more difficult time of it. But as best as I have done to prepare you, if you play against this like Clash, if you're one of the people who's playing at Clash and watching this, it's an experience. It's a very fun game, and he's a very wonderful opponent, and it is super interesting. But if you're not sure what you're up against, just go into this list and this game with the expectation to receive an education, because it is a super interesting and different list. It doesn't really play like anything else in the game. It's very, very cool. Somewhat more kind of traditionally, we have Starkey's city-states list. Starkey is from Nara, and I'm going to be honest, I'm going to toot my own horn very, very slightly here. This is a list that I think probably Saxon from Nara wrote and then played against me. And then I proceeded to have the worst reinforcement rolls I've had in any game, nearly as close as it was possible to mechanically have. It was something like a 0.2% chance for rolls that bad to materialize, but they did. And this is a double Talos list. And so my game experience was that by about turn 4, when all of my mediums finally began to arrive, there were 2 Talos blocking me out of the zones nearest to my side of the table that I wanted to get into. I did not win that game. And because I did not win that game, Starkey has decided that is a very nice thing to have happen, and he would like to replicate that situation. And so he is playing this list. Now, the good news is that the list is actually very cool, and Talos are cool and strong. We have an Aristarch Warlord to start with Atlanta's Spear. Now, we will see a Polemarch later in the list with Blades of Euclides. How you allocate these 2 very dangerous artifacts is kind of your choice. My personal preference is to have the Aristarch have the Blades and the Polemarch have the Spear. Just mathematically, it works out very, very slightly better. Blades of Euclides, the clash bonus that they give, is kind of wasted on the Polemarch. That's the reason why. But ultimately, the decision is down to how you intend to use each of the 2 regiments, right? There are nuances beyond that. Aristarch is the Warlord, which means we have the once per game free additional strat stack, and if you come off the strat stack +1 speed, yep, nice, good ability. We then have 3 Selenoi, and then 2 Chariots, both of which are Scorpios. The Aristarch is going to be in a unit of Thorakides with a Minotaur Therian Auxiliary. Now, notable here, we don't have the initiative advantage. He doesn't have the initiative mastery. So this is just a regular unit of Thorakides. It will fight well and good and fine. It will not score, because I do not believe there is combined arms drills in this list, so the list needs to score off the back of other things, but those Thorakides or the Selenoi, either of them is capable of setting a hell of a reinforcement line, right? Because the Thorakides can come off the strat stack, go to speed 7, 7 plus 7 plus 3 inches of movement up the field gives you a really nice 17 inches, which is a reinforcement line of 17 minus 2.5. 14.5 inches, which is enough much of the time for chariots to then sneak in, right? You set a reinforcement line that you can still get some zone scoring in some missions. And then we have a Talos. Talos are the city-states durable bully giant. Most people at this point will have played against them, but they pack a combined Resolve 4, Defense 3 with a shield, hardened, and fearless, which means that it is just very, very difficult to perish them. On top of that, they have flank, which means that they will always arrive very reliably on turn 3. And you can actually, if you have, in this case, this list has multiple regiments of Talos, which means that you can dedicate, if you need to, another one, your auto in on turn 3 to some other regiment, which means that this list is very good at being fully on the field by turn 3, which is quite nice in terms of it. Like, despite the fact that it has 2 heavies, it has a real forward presence. We then have the Polemarch with the Blades of Euclides in a unit of 5 Agama, that's 4 and Sacred Band veterans. There are no Sacred Band in this list. Again, as noted, the Sacred Band veterans are just a strictly superior stand of Agama. They have higher cleave and an extra wound. Excellent. We then have our second Talos. The first has Mask of Eris, the second doesn't. Mask of Eris is the one that gives Unstoppable to monster regiments within 8, so one of these Talos will be unstoppable. Both of them might if they play together, but they won't reliably play together. We then have Minotaur Haspest and a unit of Saturoi. Now, unlike the other list, unlike the Thorayetes list, one unit of Saturoi here I like, because all you need is one unit of Saturoi to present the threat that they pose, and to kind of just pull your opponent's attention back towards their side of the table. What the Saturoi do here is not necessarily damage, it's to pull resources back so that the Talos get time to get space. Because if those Talos get onto zones against anything short of like Hold Reg Warlords, they will usually score because they count as 5 stands apiece, and they are impossible to shift without many turns of sustained grinding. Like a Fallen Divinity can't kill a Talos in anything like the time it takes to actually shift one off of a zone, for example. And so just that one unit of Saturoi, just by existing and not turning up until turn 3, buys the time that you need to get those Talos onto zones, and so this list just works really nicely and cohesively as a result. It's only packing 11 activations, but the activations are all nice high quality, everything is doing something important, and it has 2 Talos. If you haven't ever had a chance to fight and try and kill Talos, one of them, let alone 2, is a very nearly impossible task, which gives you just a really nice, like, early game, it projects threat, it's got the Saturoi and the War Chariots and the Thorakides. It just fights okay if it needs to, hopes to use the Saturoi to kind of force you back. And then as soon as the Talos gets onto zones, it's scenario grind time. Different missions will require different approaches. Right? And between the Chariots, the Selenoi, the Thorakides, you've got reasonably good ability to, for example, kill objectives. The list does need to change how it plays depending on what the scenario win condition is, but provided you have the scenario win condition in mind when you deploy your forces, and particularly when you allocate the Talos, very cool list, very sound. Very fun, looks very cool on the table, just works really nicely as a way to play city-states outside of like any of the usual norms. A lot of time for this list, I really like it, and yeah, it flogged the absolute crap out of me on at least one occasion. Now finally, as we approach the very end of this marathon 3-hour slog, we get to our 200 Kingdoms list from different sides of the country. The first of these is Josh from Western Australia, and he is running the perennial classic 100 Kingdoms All Cavalry. Now, 100 Kingdoms All Cavalry has always been a vibe that has been inherently possible. It's just a cool, the army just looks incredible. It also transports quite easily, which is important if you're flying 3 hours to get here. But its fortunes have kind of waxed and waned over time. And I think this list that Josh has got here is a very interesting take, and I can sort of see how it works, and I like it. Now, one of the things that is really important to recognize is that just because horse list not automatically fast. Horses range from speed 7 to speed 9, depending on the weight of the unit in 100 Kingdoms, and there are plenty of things in the game that equal that in terms of speed. However, when the entire list is speed 7 at its lowest, speed 8 much of the time, and speed 9 some of the time, you get an average speed that is consistently very, very high. You also have just generally a lot of units that are fairly high quality here. This list is an Order Feudal pairing, which means that you get the army bonuses of both Order and Feudal. There's not necessarily a huge amount of maximization of those bonuses, but they are present and they are passive and they're fairly easy to use, and the activated ability in this list is actually quite powerful. So the Feudal ability is going to give all regiments within 8 inches of your feudal characters, but there is only one of those. It's the Feudal Mounted Noble Lord. Effectively reroll 6s on Clash and reroll 6s on Defense. And then the Priory Commander, making the list also Order, and everything is Order because the second part of Feudal is that all of your feudal regiments count as your allies' regiment type as well. all characters and veteran command stands get flurry. So the Mounted Noble Lord has flurry, the Household Knight Regiment command stands have flurry, the Mounted Squire regiments, their command stands have flurry as well. That's pretty relevant. The Sealed Temple, their regiment, their command stands have flurry. Now, the Ashen Dawn having flurry on their command stands is not necessarily the biggest thing in the world because they're natively Clash 4, which means that they would inspire to Clash 4 reroll 6s, which means that you get to reroll 5s as well with flurry. But hey, one attack per round will generally be a 5. They roll 6 dice, and the benefit does add up over the rest of the army. Now, the more important contribution that the Priory Commander is making, firstly is the Warband, which we'll go through in a moment, and is very high quality, but secondly is the Activated Supremacy. Now, the Activated Supremacy for the Orders changed in the 100 Kingdoms update. It used to give Blessed to all of your Order regiments. That was really, really powerful. Blessed is one of the best rules in the game. That was very flexible as well. That worked really well on basically all of the Order's regiments because it would let you do things like March, Charge, Clash if that was the right thing to do, and reroll your impact attacks, for example. Now, it doesn't do that. Now it does what it used to do just for Ashen Dawn. They had a separate effect because they already had Blessed. Now it gives +1 attack and Hardened to every Order regiment. That is worse on a regiment-by-regiment basis on everything except the Ashen Dawn, where it's the same, but it affects the entire list now, because the Mounted Noble Lord gained the ability to make all of his regiments count as Order. And Hardened 1 especially, on an entire army that is Defense 4, which most of the army is significant. Now, as mentioned, this list has a fair bit of maneuverability. It is fast. It is not forced to commit if it doesn't want to. It's got plenty of scoring. The scoring gets up the field relatively quickly. But it has no ranged. And so there will be a time in most games, if this is playing against like a Dweghom box, for example, where the list has to gather its strength and then commit. It has to full send. And having Hardened 1 on your entire army, particularly when large parts of the army are rerolling 6s to save as well because of the Noble Lord ability, means that you can full send this list and actually do things like weather Dweghom gun battery fire, which is very important, actually a pretty meaningful addition of the Sealed Temple Priory Commander. Now, the list otherwise, what are we dealing with? Priory Commander, Sealed Temple, Callidburn, and Tip of the Lance. Callidburn means that all, it's not quite all defense rolls, but it may as well be. Technically speaking, Callidburn is just a worst version of Kiss of the Dealer Sword, but it makes no difference for practical purposes. The impact attacks and the clash attacks from the Priory Commander Sealed Temple, and that Priory Commander will be making 8 attacks on Supremacy turns, 7 otherwise, and 5 impacts. You get a lot of return from Callidburn. Tip of the Lance gives wedge to his regiment. So that Sealed Temple regiment gets to Fluid Formation to get a nice long charge distance, speed 8 with a reroll, charge into contact, make a bunch of impacts. The impacts from the Priory Commander, you will be forced to reroll your saves, and then a whole bunch of Cleave 1 attacks, and again, rerolling successful saves from the Priory Commander. This is a really good unit to just whoom in, charge, Alpha Strike. Anything that this connects into with a charge clash has a very good chance of dying. Just a good, strong, dangerous regiment. We've then got a second unit of Order of the Sealed Temple. Now, my general, actually not experience, I've not run 2 units of Order of the Sealed Temple, but my expectation of the second unit of Order of the Sealed Temple is that it's still good, but it's not going to be the same as the unit with the Priory Commander. And there are a couple of reasons why. The first is that by themselves, they're not as dangerous. Like, he is producing a lot of the damage in that regiment. But the second reason is that maximizing Fluid Formation really wants as wide a unit as possible. 5 is kind of ideal, but 4 is a good practical number to get maximum distance off of Fluid Formation much of the time. They are just 3, which means that they don't extend their threat quite as far, but they're still dangerous. They still benefit from the Order Supremacy. You have Flurry on the command stand. It's still a good, solid, dangerous unit. And importantly, they're a mainstay which unlocks not just your first but also your second unit of Order of the Ashen Dawn. Ashen Dawn are still one of the best regiments in the game. They are balanced now, but they are balanced in the context of being a very difficult to access, restricted, expensive, heavy regiment, which means that yes, they're difficult to access, and yes, they are heavy. That second unit might not be present until turn 4. However, they go super hard. They're very, very durable. They're a fantastic brawler regiment. They're pretty good at taking basically all comers. They will fight well regardless of what they have to fight into. Really, like, the only things that you wouldn't necessarily want to run them into is like headlong into a Talos, just because that will be inefficient. But even then, they'll take that fight for a really, really long time. It's as hard for the Talos to hurt them as it is for them to hurt the Talos. Just a generally good, well-rounded regiment, and they are the slowest regiment in the list, tied with the Household Knights, but they are still speed 7 with a standard bearer. We then have the Mounted Noble Lord. He has a few abilities that are important here. So, Weapon Master gives him Cleave 1, which means that in addition to Flurry, he only has 5 attacks, but he can help the regiment of knights that he's in kind of fight their way through a brawl if he needs to. More importantly, he's got Art of War and the Oliphant's Roar. Art of War is not a hugely commonly taken 100 Kingdoms mastery. It is 30 points just for an activation. While the character with Art of War is on the field, once per round you can just pass activation back to your opponent. It's 30 points for an activation. Now, this list kind of wants something like that because it's a very, very elite list. It is just 2 warbands, it has 8 regiments, 2 characters, and you want more than just 10 activations. No problem, 30 points gets you to 11, which is enough to play the game against someone with 12 kind of without any issues. There is another use case for Art of War, which we'll see in the next list, but in this case it's just insurance against the bottom level, you don't get hugely out-activated. Oliphant's Roar gives Glorious Charge to the unit of knights that he is joining, which is in the case is going to be a 5-strong regiment of veteran household knights. Now, Glorious Charge is +1 clash when making impact attacks and terrifying 1 for impact attacks. And what that opens up is march charge attacks with that regiment, because usually a veteran household knight regiment, they're efficient, right? If you have all of the buffs on them, if you get veteran for free, if you're benefiting from a feudal aura, then the household knight regiment is fine for 160 points. It's totally fine for 160 points. But it's just 160 points. There's a limit to what you expect from 160 point medium MSU. When you get into bigger regiments, they don't necessarily scale up that well without some external force multiplier, and the Oliphant's Roar represents that, because the big regiment of household knights is making 18 impact attacks, on average 12 of which will hit. Most of them will have Brutal Impact 1, a couple will have Brutal Impact 2, and all of them will have Terror 1. That is more damage output than that big Cataphract regiment that we saw, like lower Brutal Impact, but more hits than that big Cataphract regiment we saw in Old Dominion, which is to say, it is a march charge that pretty reliably wipes out many of the MSUs in the game. And because you can do that from downtown, right, 7+7+ rerollable d6, you even have the option of potentially threatening Thunder Riders if they zone you too aggressively, for example. That one's admittedly pretty dicey, but it is an option that exists. You theoretically have higher threat range if you roll really well. Don't feed Household Knights to Thunder Riders. If the Thunder Riders overextend, absolutely take the jump, however. And given that there are turns where you will have to full send, being able to be like, yep, no worries, the first activation of the round, boom, we're going to pop the Order Supremacy, march charge, kill a regiment, and now we are defense 3 with shields with hardened 1, rerolling sisters to save. We're going to be fine, we'll go the distance, and everything else is closing at the same time. This is one of the hammer regiments in the list, but the list has got, because it's not running a high activation count, it's also got Order of the Ashen Dawn, which are a hammer and an anvil, Order of the Sealed Temple, which are definitely a hammer. It's got plenty of stuff going on. We've then got the 2nd Regiment of Household Knights and 2 regiments of veteran mounted squires. Now, the veteran mounted squires do a couple of important things in this list, but it is important to recognize their limitations. The very important things that they do are, firstly, continue the bit. What are you going to take infantry there in this list? Of course you're not. That would be ridiculous. That would mean the list is not all horses. Beyond that, these guys are speed 9 and they have banners, which means that they move 19 inches up on the first turn, which sets a reinforcement line that just answers your, well, how do I score thing. A lot of 100 Kingdoms lists will use infantry for early scoring, because infantry in the new 100 Kingdoms get a bonus to their command stand's scoring weight based on the resolve bonus that they get. Large units score better. And so you can have a unit of 4 light stands that scores. This list doesn't do that, but it doesn't need to, because those mounted squires get so far forward that you can just boop a unit of household knights onto a zone, even in something like Maelstrom. The second thing that they do is be really annoyingly difficult to kill against ranged attacks. Tenacious 2 against ranged, defense 2 with a shield is not that massive, but Tenacious 2 is a really powerful rule. And these guys can just kind of zone in and around range units, and eventually on that turn when you full send, there will almost always be enough enough of them left to make the dive forward. And if they make the dive forward, they can just pin an enemy range unit in place, which allows that kind of space to close with the rest of the list. And if that's not a thing that you need to do, well, they just play around the rest of the list. They just wait. They just move somewhere. They are very, very fast. They do have opportunist, and so if they aren't needed to zone, they aren't needed to threaten other regiments. They do things like they out-threaten things like hunting pack, for example. If you've got Wadhrun that are zoning in on you, mounted squires are a really good answer to early game Wadhrun pressure, because it's Wadhrun, like slingers do enough damage that they do push through the tenacious, but not that aggressively. And mounted squires out-threaten hunting pack, and if mounted squires charge hunting pack, even in the front, they will kill them. Hunting pack are too fragile. And so they just provide that like level of, in 2 units, just a little bit of early insurance against aggression that buys you time for the mediums and then the heavies to arrive. The list does not arrive super, super aggressively. My general expectation is that the Noble Lord would probably be the first regiment onto the field on turn 2, just because he has Art of War, but that could definitely change. You could build up and surge later in the game. You have the speed to do so. Sure, you might give up a little bit of scoring in some circumstances, but it's not the end of the world if it wins you the game. And generally, yes, this is a list with a bit. It's an all-cavalry list. That's super cool. Is it competitively optimal? That's not really actually important. What's important is that you've got a vibe that you're going for, and you have competitively optimized to that vibe. And if you asked me to build a list that was 100% cavalry, I don't think I would land particularly far from this. It's a very interesting list. I'm pretty sure that Josh played something like this at CanCon this year, where he landed a very respectable 4th place, just short of podium, so very, very well done in a competitive field. And I would be very unsurprised if he didn't do I would be very surprised if he didn't do at least that well this year. And that brings us to our last and final 100 Kingdoms list, which is me. This is my 100 Kingdoms list. I'm playing a Clash at the Coast. Now, I have had a series of events over the last month. We've actually had, this is going to be the 3rd Conquest event I attended in 6 weeks' time, which is super cool. So an event every 2 weeks. Getting ready for a break after that, but it's been very, very fun. And my original plan was to play something kind of different every event. Maybe a different alliance, maybe a different list. I took a Theist Imperial list to the first event. And while I think that list would have been improved had I had access to Crusaders, I didn't. I only had access to Sakari, which are not Crusaders. The list nevertheless did very well. Had 3 really good games with it. Probably the biggest weakness of Theist feudal lists, if you're a 100 Kingdoms player, is that they have no real way to pad reinforcement rolls. They can just crap out. But that didn't happen particularly badly in 3 rounds. Had some really inconsistent light reinforcement rolls, but otherwise it was fine. And so yeah, did quite well with that. Then I wrote this list, and I wasn't sure about whether or not I wanted to play it, but we had the Anzac Cup coming up, and I was thinking, do I play this at Clash? It's kind of interesting. If I'm going to play it at Clash, maybe I don't play it at Anzac Cup. And I mentioned that to Saxon when we were talking about 100 Kingdoms list, because he's also a 100 Kingdoms player, and he just deadpanned the hell out of me, and he said, that's a great idea, Rob. We have a non-Worlds qualifier event coming up in a couple of days that you could go and test this list in competitive circumstances, without having to worry about anything like rankings or numeric or anything like that. You shouldn't do that. Instead, just raw dog it straight to Clash at the Coast. And I'm no stranger to sarcasm. I took that advice on board. So I actually played this list at Anzac Cup a week and a bit ago. And my concern, and you'll probably see why this is the case as we get into it, my concern was that the list would be a little bit boring. Would be a little bit one note, because it's trying to do one thing to a bit of an extreme. That actually wasn't the case. The list proved over multiple games to be way more interesting to play than I had expected, and I found that I needed to change my approach to the game multiple times. The list needed to handle, because it's a little one-dimensional, not one-dimensional exactly, but it's not got a lot of unit variety, but it does have a kind of rare tool in terms of how it can play, and the applicability of that needed to change from match to match. And what I have found is that I have kind of accidentally invented Wood Elves. And to explain why that's the case, let me jump through the list. So we start with a Noble Lord. Now, this is, for clarity, this is a feudal imperial list. A mounted noble lord will be the warlord, a chapter mage will be the dynastic ally. So what that means is that veteran infantry regiments, there are only 4 of those, but veteran infantry regiments once per game will get a free reform and opportunist. That's going to let the men-at-arms regiments have sort of quite a long threat range on certain turns. And it's going to give vanguard to 2 infantry regiments each turn, which will usually happen over at least 3 turns of the game. Feudal, as mentioned in the previous list, feudal is the aura of reroll 6s to hit and 6s to save, and this list has 3 feudal characters. So basically every feudal regiment will always be benefiting from that, and that's something to bear in mind. So we have A Noble Lord with Caliburn and Eccentric Fighting Style. Between that and the Weapon Arts, that means this character has 8 attacks on Class 3, goes to 4 with Inspire, Cleave 1, full rerolls, enemy rerolls all saves. This guy is an absolute beater. In a duel, he dies immediately to anything, but he also kills anything without Quicksilver Strikes. More importantly, however, he is an absolute beater. He reliably kills multiple stands of the enemy by himself every turn because he will usually land 7 or 8 hits, cleave 1 and reroll successful saves, means that most of those wounds connect, so he's just very dangerous. And then he is in a big block of Men-at-Arms. This is 5 Men-at-Arms with a seasoned veteran. He is going to use his personal bodyguard rule to make them veteran. Now, these Men-at-Arms are not hugely dangerous, but they have 20 wounds, and they're hardened 1, and they're untouchable, so they're pretty durable. Their resolve is pants, it's just resolve 3 plus size bonus, but they can weather through a little bit more than you would expect, and they aren't an expensive regiment. 185 points is pretty reasonable, and their damage output with reroll 6s to hit is not bad. It's not great, the Noble Lords do most of the work, but it's not bad. We then have a unit of 3 Longbowmen, then another Noble Lord, no upgrades this time, in the same unit of Men-at-Arms. 5 veteran, seasoned veteran, and he'll be making them veteran with his personal bodyguard. So 2 pretty decent size infantry units with a little bit of ability to brawl that generate an aura, reasonably durable, then another unit of Longbowmen. So 2 units of Longbowmen, non-veteran. So far so good. We then have 2 chapter mages, each in a unit of mercenary crossbowmen. The first chapter mage is School of Water and has Art of War. The second chapter mage is School of Fire. So one offensive, quite nice offensive school in terms of Fire Dart. The other heals, and Art of War brings an additional activation. We then have a mounted Noble Lord with no upgrades. This is the Warlord because the Warlord makes all of his regiments in the Warband veteran. And he is in an MSU of Household Knights. He has a second MSU of Household Knights in his Warband, and then 2 units of veteran Longbows who are veteran because of the Warlord ability. Now, there's nothing I've mentioned that is like, oh yeah, that's just a bunch of stuff. There's no heavies, it's all mediums and lights. Only 2 of the light regiments score. The Longbowmen, there aren't enough stands in them. What's the thing here? Well, the thing here is there's a lot of activations. When you factor in Art of War, this is a 16 activation list. On top of that, it has 2 wizards, 6 stands of mercenary crossbows, and 12 stands of longbows, which means it's also a bit of a gun line. Now, it's just a bit of a gun line. There are 4 solid quality, well, 3.5 solid quality melee units, and you have to be very limited in your expectations of what Longbowmen can accomplish, because they have 3 shots each with volley 2. That means that, on average, a stand that doesn't get to aim lands like maybe 3, sometimes 4 hits. However, that level of activation control warps the game. Conquest is a game that is built around alternating activations. I go, you go, I go, you go, I go, you go. We have known for a very long time that alternating activation games they do find there is an exploitable point where activation advantage gives you an unanswerable sequence of activations at the end of the turn that your opponent can't respond to. Conquest has a bunch of mechanisms in place that prevent that from being overpowered. But some of those have been rolled back in recent updates, and the advantage does still exist. It just, you can't capitalize on it in the way that you can like Song of Ice and Fire, where 1 or 2 activation advantage in Song of Ice and Fire just turns into play after play of grotesque power. That doesn't happen in Conquest. But activation advantage is still real, and 16 activations is just beyond what most players are used to playing against. On top of that, 4 units of longbows have some of the longest ranges and longest threat ranges in the game. 22-inch range is not equaled by anything except marksman clones, and longbows are faster than marksman clones. Which means, even if the damage output isn't high, this list gets to just poke and poke and poke at you from early in the game. Now, what tends to happen after that is that if you don't start pulling those longbows back, 22 inches is a long way, but it's not that far. And you start getting charged and jumped and everything collapsed and it's all terrible, and your melee units are not high enough quality to fight their way out of the subsequent fight. But if you play everything just right, if you push forward, you poke, you pull the longbows backwards as they begin to be threatened, you give up the aiming bonuses, sometimes you march, if you have to, you pull back out of enemy threat ranges, you can play this game where you dance forward, dance back, poke at the opponent, pull them in, score while you're doing that, and then, only after your opponent has been whittled down and shot by arrows and hit by the occasional spell, do you engage in a decisive melee engagement. And it's just really interesting to play. Now, there are just a bunch of lists that we have seen today that can play this list, that can play against this list just fine. There are Dweghom lists that can just give Harden 1 to everything and Steel Shaper heal through the chip damage from the longbows. There are Yoroni lists that can build up and surge forward. There's an all-cavalry 100 Kingdoms list with 2 units of Squires with Tenacious 2 against ranged. There's city-states that can literally hit me almost in my deployment line on turn 2, right? This is a list that doesn't just mechanically roll over anything in the entire field. Even that Wadhrun list that, by God, I helped Alex write, has tons of hardened Thunder Riders, which means I just can't reliably shoot them down as they close in. But I have 16 activations, which means that in every single game against every single opponent, I am liable to have usually at least 3 activations at the end of a round that I can do something with that my opponent can't respond to. And combined with the move forward, pull back, position carefully, Wood Elf style of play, it's a really interesting list to play. It's actually really, really interesting. I enjoyed every game that I played at Anzac Cup with it. I've enjoyed every game that I've played since. There have been 100 Kingdoms Goblin mode lists floating around for absolute ages, but they have always historically just used units that I don't find particularly resonant. I don't like mercenary crossbows, especially now that they're range 16. They're hot trash. Their sole purpose is to carry around, in my opinion, their sole purpose is to carry around a chapter mage, so that the command stand alone fires some shots occasionally. But this list, with overlapping auras, and just good enough melee, and scenario presence, because you get Vanguard on 2 regiments every turn, and depending on what arrives in any given turn, maybe we've got some cavalry, right? So on turn 2, depending on how many mediums arrive, we'll Vanguard 2 mediums and bring on some cavalry. And then on turn 3, we'll usually still have some infantry to arrive, so we'll bring on infantry and cavalry. You can just build the mix like that. And it's just, in total, a list that plays in a way that is far more interesting than I expected it to be when I wrote it, because I expected it to be one note. But it turns out that the movement forward, the movement backwards, plays that you can make where you push the longbow forward and then you pull them back just far enough that you can move over the top with the infantry regiments and adopt a more classic 100 Kingdoms formation where it's men-at-arms front, longbows behind. All of it has just been super interesting. I do not think I can play this list properly for 5 rounds. I'm just going to make that honest self-appraisal. The level of complication that is involved just in ordering a command stack of 15 cards plus Art of War, I don't think I can do that for 5 games. I think I'm going to be an absolute hot mess. I traditionally sleep terribly before big tournaments. I'm going to be an absolute hot mess. I don't think I can play this list properly for 5 rounds, but it is a super interesting list. And it's a list that is just going to be presenting a style of play that most people won't have played against, because no one plays 50. When was the last time you, the viewer, played against a 16 activation list in a 2,000 point game of Conquest? Have you ever played against a 16 activation list in a 2,000 point game of Conquest? It's an experience. It's super interesting. I am really looking forward to playing this, and then I'm looking forward to putting it down, because as fun as it is only suitable for competition play. The problem with this list in casual play, and why I don't recommend it in casual play without talking to your opponents first, is that it breaks the fundamental promise that Conquest makes, which is this is an alternating activation game. It's going to be your turn, then my turn, and then your turn, and my turn, and you will not have to wait long for it to be your turn again. In this list, if you go first in a turn where I have a weight of activations over you, there can just be a bunch of time that passes where you've taken your last activation. I've got 5 things left to do. And in casual play, where we're not trying to win an event, that sucks. And so I will be putting this list aside after I finish this event, however it performs. It may do well, it may do okay. I'd be surprised if I get absolutely flogged, right? My average placement at Conquest events is fairly solid. But I am very much looking forward to playing it and see how people play against it. And having now gone through all of the lists that I'm playing up against, I think there's plenty that present strong mechanical answers to this, and we'll just have to see how I play against them when they turn up. So, that concludes a truly marathon 22 list review and analysis for Clash at the Coast happening in Nara on the 26th and 27th of April. If you're going to be there, I look very much forward to seeing everyone. What did I get wrong about your list? If you're going to turn up, tell me. What did I get that was completely wrong? What did I say that you thought that's completely weird, or I hadn't thought of that? Please do let me know. If you're not going to be there and you've watched this video anyway, if you're just interested in Conquest content, I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that you have enjoyed this insight into the slightly ramshackle Australian meta. We are comprised of many very disparate communities. We're a long way away from each other geographically, and so you tend to get this effect in Conquest tournaments in Australia, where ideas emerge in isolation and they are tested in the crucible of everyone coming together for these big events. You see that at CanCon, and I really am excited to see the fact that you'll now see that as well at Clash at the Coast, if it continues to be a big event going forward. It's a super nice town, it's a super nice venue, and the event organizers have done a cracking job. So that wraps up this video. I hope very much that you've enjoyed this. Just as a quick plug, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. I mostly produce Infinity content, Infinity the Game by Corvus Belli, but I also cover Conquest by Parabellum, and will occasionally cover other games as well. It's the support of channel supporters that allow me to continue to do this. This is not otherwise my day job. And so big thanks to everyone who has supported the channel so far. Also, big thanks to Mark, who is organizing Clash of the Coast, who arranged list submission and got everything through to me in time to do this video. I understand that all of these lists will be going live basically the same time, like they should already be available to players. And if they're not, players, this was my first look at them, and this video is going up basically as soon as I finish recording it. So you'll see them at the same time as me, just about. For those who are attending Clash, I look forward very much to seeing you there. For everyone else who's watched this video, I hope very much that you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.